Keeping his hand on his gray beard, the priest announces the task. The girl looks at the old interlocutor in confusion, listening to the task in which she must catch up with the prince and stop his rebellion that can destroy the entire empire. It was a warm, sunny day outside, and the smell of roses was in the air. In the darkness, only the sounds of dripping blood could be heard, and with it came the smell. And here a man's silhouette appeared unexpectedly, on which bloodstains were clearly visible. He was a boy with dark hair, the owner of stern blue eyes. In one hand he held someone who showed no signs of life, and in the other a sword with a bloody blade. His stern blue eyes turned to the witness. The red-haired girl, who was a witness, looked with fear at the one who was standing in front of him, but he could not lower his gaze and not look away, while his small hands were clutching his sleeve. And so a couple of days passed. The weather was warm and clear in the forest. The birds sat on one of the branches of a tree in the garden. Red curls of hair from under the blanket were visible on the bed. There was a monastery in the forest, which had lush roses in its gardens. Everywhere in the silence of the forest, a woman's voice could be heard from the building, trying to wake up someone who had been sleeping for a long time. The dark-haired woman tried to wake up the sleeping pet with claps. The blanket completely covered the red-haired girl, wanting to sleep. The woman was ready for such an answer. As a result, she exhaled calmly, as if she was preparing to give up on waking up, but sharply lifts the blanket to wake up the redhead. Red curls of hair spread out from under the blanket that had been pulled away. A necklace with stones shone from the sun, which released the sun bunnies. The key to the exit was the sun's rays and allowed them to run across the ceiling of the room. Her pet, who had red hair, sleepy sapphire eyes, and a necklace was visible on the bed, looked sleepy, but despite the blanket, she still can't get up. Bent over, she still shows a desire not to get up and feels cold without a warm blanket. The woman orders to get dressed. The headmistress says that the high priest is waiting for her, and the girl seemed to wake up. Surprise was visible in her eyes. The girl Filia jumped up from a bent position, asking why. In response, the dark-haired woman looked at the small interlocutor, holding a white blanket, which she did not give away for a certain time. To this question, the headmistress only bent down so that her eyes were at the level of her child's eyes. The look remained so unwaveringly stern that the redhead felt awkward. The woman looks intently into the eyes and began to count the numbers in her mind. The blue-eyed girl froze in the same position under the tension, without taking her eyes off. As soon as the calculation in the woman's head, which Filia could read, ended, her gaze was not distracted by anything, and the room became brighter and brighter from the sun. In the woman's head, the girl was able to see several visual images with the high priest, but very clearly, but without a certain reference, voices were heard. The eyes seemed to shine like a precious stone, shining from the daylight. In the reflection of the woman's eyes, there was a red-haired girl who did not take her sapphire eyes away. The woman's gaze was stern, but there was a kind of caring warmth. On Filia's face, there was only a complete misunderstanding from these puzzles that the headmistress gave. A dark-haired woman, as if she knows what the girl is thinking about and has certain abilities of telepathy, mentally asks, mentally turning and ready to get to her feet. The red-haired woman seemed to come to her senses and again directed her gaze at the headmistress. On the street, the sky was still clear, the sun's rays reflected from the golden bell that hung openly in the tower of the monastery. From the setting sun, cold light covered the throne hall. On the throne lay a crown similar to a crown of thorns, and on it were located two precious stones. The rose monastery stood in the middle of the forest, absorbing the scent of red roses. Filia, not in the mood and not yet ready to wake up, went into the living room, expecting a guest. A gray-haired good man was sitting in a chair, who waved his hand to the headmistress and her pupils. But the girls had no reaction to the greeting, silence in response. The red-haired girl approached the sofa, said that during her long absence, Verkhovny had hardly changed, but he replied that there had been no change in manners in the girls' conversation. The girl bent down on the sofa, which was standing to the side, and asked why he was here, to which the gray-haired priest answered briefly so that she could guess for herself. The gaze shifted from the mug of tea to Filia. Without a clue, the girl remained silent, as did the headmistress herself, but he was still silent, smiling sweetly, waiting for an answer. The blue-eyed girl's gaze lit up again as she began scrolling through the countdown, preparing to read his mind completely to find out the very answer. He just looked back in silence, but his eyes did not shine like the heroine's. The countdown ended, and a telepathic link was established between the priest and Filia. The birds chirped among themselves and decided to fly away. Filia read the thoughts of the old priest, but as with the headmistress, she only heard abrupt phrases. And the look still remains unmoved and calm, still waiting for an answer. The eyes still shone like sapphires, and something dawned on the girl that her eyes became bigger. She jumped up, snarling at the gray-haired priest, frightened by something, but he did not understand the reaction and only laughed softly. She yells for him to stop teasing and explain. With a calm look, he still tries to explain, begs her to do one favor. Filia sharply answered categorically, without even hearing. The eyes are scared, and the answer is clear. All adults are confused. The office is lit by daylight, and you can hear birds chirping through the windows. In cryptic phrases, Verkhovny asks the girl what makes her more and more afraid. Silence reigned in the room again. The girl was still so frightened. However, he still took himself in hand to hear the request. Filia first asks, what threat can she expect? Keeping her hands to herself, however, she had already moved away from the back of the sofa. The priest gives the command to go to the count and takes a sip from a white porcelain mug. The girl was unpleasantly surprised, but he continued to say that it was necessary to preach for his disobedient daughter. The girl violently begins to resent the fact that he once again puts hard work on her children's shoulders and questions her about preaching. But he moves away from the question and reminds her that she has the status of a priestess and says that they are waiting. Filia indignantly inhaled and remembers the previous preaching. 3 places ago, in the memories, she had to help. But the dictator himself was haughty and unfriendly to the priestess. He ordered something to be done with his disobedient son, raised his leg and put it on the other, holding his head. The dictator's son, in a dark corner, hissed at the heroine like a wild animal, bared his teeth, and spread his arms as if he was preparing to attack. Filia nervously shook her head, panicking before her new task, and the gray-haired grandfather only laughed at her reaction and only spoke about the flattering reviews and told about the girl's new nickname, Angel of Roses. Everything not only caused the red-haired person violent indignation, but also made him blush at such a nickname. When the headmistress repeated with interest, the girl again blushed harder and begged with a shout not to name it and not to repeat it. The high priest extended the story that the rumor reached there, and they sent a plea for help. He repeated the call, and she only growled to stop. In a raised tone, she expresses the opinion that she does not want to babysit children like the child herself. Confidently pressing his hand to his chest, but the man's voice calmly refuses for some reason. The room was illuminated by the setting sun. And the room is darker. However, Filia expressed her indignation, while those silently listened to her, that this was not the last time they would be burdened with such work. However, the high priest's voice sounded confident and cold, naming the girl, and she fell silent from such a gray-haired man's tone and only responded with the question, yes, but in her usual cheerful voice, she stubbornly says that she is going anyway. The day illuminated the cross on the monastery with a golden hue. The next day, the roses have woken up from the warm rays of the sun, and the sky is all so blue. In a bad mood, Filia left the monastery, stopped in front of something, looked ahead with disgust. The high priest, in good humor, accompanies the pupil of the headmistress, extending his hands to the entrance of a very beautiful, spacious carriage. And the door was also held by a gray-haired grandfather in a coachman's outfit. The girl turned her head to the Supreme and suspiciously asked what he was up to. He, like the first time, turns into a fool, asks what it is for, and she repeats the usual question. The mountains stood like guardians of order and provided an opportunity to stay in the cool shade. And trying to find out about one's destination keeps repeating itself and refusing to leave. The gray-haired priest stubbornly insists on going and reassures that everyone is so reluctant to go out into the world. Everything is so calm and playful. However, Filia incredulously agrees and looks in disbelief at the coachman, who sees first. Before entering, the priest's face became stern again. He told her to be careful in a slightly alarming tone. The little priestess just stared in disbelief and indignation at the new task. The headmistress was standing on the threshold of the monastery, escorting the girl from the place, waving her hand in farewell. Once inside the carriage, her distrust and indignation changed to insecurity and fear. The red-haired woman grabbed the place where the necklace hung under her clothes and asked the priest, as if to an elder, if she could remove the necklace if necessary. He answered directly if necessary, but secretly. The directness and severity of the irresponsible supreme was felt loudly. When the door closed, a storm of emotions arose in the 10-year-old girl. Anger at the priest due to her insecurity in front of the outside world. She stomped her feet out of anger, and her hands nervously held her face. He reached the city. Filia looked out the window of the carriage, where there were many people. She watched the window with a suspicious look. It is unusual to watch a large number of people. The owner of the sapphire eyes sat down and tried to calm her anxious heart. From the anxiety about the society's acceptance of her, she tried to calm her heart, promised that she would end this as soon as possible and return. The hands clenched tighter, and the high priest's words before the task were in his mind. He was clutching his mantle, his heart seemed to listen and was beating steadily, and there was confidence in the look of the priestess. The little priestess arrived, immediately took on the role of a small, sweet, kind girl who exuded warmth and happiness. The carriage arrived at its destination, and she went out to meet the host, immediately introducing herself. Near the house, the count met with the maids, waiting for the Angel of Roses, with posters and hospitality. Filia began to run up in front of them, which made the hospitality of the image disappear. The faces of the maids and the count were shocked by the guest who had come to help, and she still ran to them with such a cute role, despite her indignation. They did not believe what they saw, began to negotiate among themselves, accusing hearsay and deception. The girl expected such a reaction and expects that tasks will be given in the future. In her role, she again clearly answered the question of the dissatisfied count, who could not believe that she helped the dictator with his devil son. Closer to her, with a thoughtful look, he asked about her age, to which she clearly answered with a smile that she was 10 years old. And the count's face was increasingly indignant. That hostility and negativity could be felt from the owner's side. The girl, sensing such a hostile aura, began to feel insecure and depressed herself, but her smile did not fade. She did not leave her role. But despite the hostility, the count invited the little guest to his house, accepted this truth. The priestess herself did not feel awkward, ready for the tilings from the maids, who were now silently watching the guest behind the count's back. The rich man immediately asked his maid to take him to his daughter Cleo. The rich man introduced himself as Count Gizanon. The owner's face showed despair from a problem in the family. If he cures in a week, he will reward the little priestess. The girl, in her role as a pretty girl, grabbed his hand, which was unusual for him, but remained silent. She asked about the time limit he set for healing and why, to which the man with the gray mustache cleared his throat and replied that she should get married soon. The happy expression on the girl's face disappeared, and she began to think about it. Lips repeated the words of the girl's father, but without a sound, in order to postpone in her memory this certain clue in solving the question. Again she pretended to be a pretty priestess, but without that happy glow that had gone before, she pretended to understand. Everyone entered the house, which covered the warm sunlight with a roof covered with red tiles and whitewashed walls. Inside the mansion, everything was kept in red and white style. The patterns were painted with gilding, and red curtains hung over the door arches. The little guest was accompanied by 2 silent maids. With a sullen look, the girl wanted to finish and not help. In her mind, she remembered the wishes of success from her mentors. The headmistress carefully sat down at the level of Filia's head, and the supreme nodded to himself with a proud smile. Lily was still following the maids, lost in the memories of her mentors and her purpose. However, the desire to reduce the amount of work given by the priest awakened an aura of treachery and malice, and the maids looked at it and considered it strange. With a positive and confident attitude, the priestess ordered the door to be opened, to which they obediently began to open the door for her. The wooden door began to open the room with a creak. He turned on the cute girl again. The redhead entered the teenager's room. But a very unpleasant picture began to unfold in front of her, that there was neither a smile nor a ray of happiness on her face. The sun's rays penetrated through the broken windows. They probably broke them out of insanity and held on to the window frames like that. The white-stained curtains were tattered and had holes, and a short-haired blonde was sitting by the window. The room is plunged into chaos and neglect. On the chair, like a porcelain doll. The stockings are in holes, and she herself seems tired of life. The girl froze at the sight of the room and the count's daughter, trying to think of further actions. She seemed to be in a stupor. The girl's eyes were full of despair and pain. The cosmetics washed off from the eyes from crying. and the teenager paid attention to the guest. Filia seemed to feel pain, and her mood changed. The crown is broken in half, which directly speaks of the onset of chaos or destruction, but the stones opposite each other in shade are kept in place. Night. On the edge of the earth stands a purple-gray castle with lights burning everywhere. Pale purple, scary castle. But the inhabitants of the castle have by no means warm feelings. Of the warm shades, only red is red blood on the blade of the royal sword. A silhouette that runs through the thorny path, the dark depths of the forest thicket, from where it is difficult to get out, and this legend worried not a few people among the population. Filia stood still in the same place, frozen like a sculpture, only showing signs of life as blinking eyes and breathing made her alive. Her sapphire eyes again began to glow sapphire like moonlight. The girl deliberately began to use her telepathic abilities again. Not taking her eyes off the rich man's daughter, she also kept her eyes on the little guest, smiling so sadly. And the countdown began in Lily's head. During the middle of the calculation, a tear rolled down the girl's cheek, from sadness and sadness, because what she saw and read in the girl's head could not be compared to physical pain. Keeping his eyes on her, the account ended by itself. The silence lasted for a long time between them, and in the eyes of the priestess, Cleo saw energy, the color of despair and sadness. Filia completed the telepathic process, understood the problem, immediately remembered the high priest who sent here for such a difficult task. Having realized everything, she needs to take a breath from what she saw, exhale, and close her eyes for a second. Cleo broke the silence between them and greeted them, inviting the guest to come closer. The smile did not fade. The redhead refused to answer. Out of anger, a glass of water flew towards Filia, breaking into small pieces, and drops of water hit the red-haired priestess. The girl could not react quickly, but looked at the wet wall in fear. Cleo sat down straight and began to ask the guest if the maids had said anything bad about her. In response, the priestess briefly denied, but the teenager was not convinced. The fair-haired girl almost jumped up with rage, shouting at the guest not to lie. Her face was maddened with rage, like a predator, ready to attack. The redhead just kept silent in response, lowered her eyes. Out of rage, the thin, short-haired girl fell to the floor from weakness, since she had eaten almost nothing, but there was a lot of alcohol in her blood. The teenager gasped. Cleo had no intention of talking to the priestess. He raised his angry face towards the guest. The maid came into the room from the commotion and noise. She was shocked to see all this mess. However, the teenager threw things that she could pick up and throw in the direction of the guest. Filia stood calmly. The maids ran up to the count's daughter, holding the angry girl, trying to calm the drunkard. While two of them calmed down, one girl, the third maid, worriedly brought a handkerchief to the guest, who kept her eyes on the 17-year-old girl. Night fell on the street. A crescent moon shone in the sky. All the walls turned black. No light was visible anywhere. The little priestess couldn't sleep today, and her emotions as she looked at the beautiful night sky through the window in the guest room. Only now did I understand that I should not have looked into the eyes of Gazanon's daughter. After that, she remembered how they started to discuss when they left the teenager's room, behind the priestess's back, that it might all be a hoax, why they sent the girl. They said they couldn't help. The branch expected, but if they don't do anything, they will be forced to think that it is a fake and send it back, which the girl didn't really want after what she saw. My soul became heavy. Longing overtook me. The despair that hides behind the smile flashed in her memory again. She repeated in her mind again that it was not worth looking into her eyes. In a sitting position, crossed her arms, put her head on them. That incident in the room, the maid came and tried to calm her down. Filia did not react to the antics. She again began to play the role of a cute child and cried hysterically, at which the maid began to calm the child and look in the direction of the count's daughter. The little priestess noticed how everyone was looking askance at Cleo. No one could understand her at all and didn't try to feel the pain. Pity for the blonde flashed in his sapphire eyes. The redhead put her head on the surface of the windowsill and thought about something. The girl got up from the chair. Raising her pitiful eyes to the moon, she thought about the situation. She grabbed the necklace with her hand and squeezed it hard out of anger. Those moments of the first meeting between them loomed in my head, how they held it tightly. Lily removed the necklace from her neck, convincing herself that it was not for a bad cause. In the count's office, He was furiously pounding his fists on the surface of the table. He cursed the church. He was angry because he believed people's rumors and let in a false angel. Under the moonlight, something began to happen in the guest room, blowing the redhead's curls around the room. The Earl ordered his butler to bring the priestess tomorrow for a conversation, and directly said that something was wrong with the guest. Suddenly, the girl grew up hearing about the moonlight. Long, beautiful swan neck. Claro's father's orders came from the room not to feed her, to make her completely exhausted, to tie her hands and feet, and she herself lay exhausted on the bed, unable to cry anymore, because her tears had run out. A very grown-up girl was standing in the guest's room, holding a necklace in her hands. The wind blew some fibers back, and the curtains moved in the direction of the girl. A cold look directed at the night sky. In the guest room, Filia was already grown up. Her hair was blown by the draft from the window, reaching the length of her slender waist. They hung back. The disgruntled rich man was still growling, loudly ordering the servants to bring it. Bringing herself to her senses, she stood silently with her eyes closed. The eyes slowly opened, and the hair seemed to be alive and fluttered all over the room. The branch became itself. A very thin, red-haired 18-year-old girl was standing in the room. It was unusual for her to return to an adult body after a long time, briefly looking at her adult body, but she breathed her last. But with a decisive decision, she turned to the window. It is not time to worry about the change of body. She confidently stepped on the windowsill with her bare foot. Filia stood completely on the windowsill, raised her eyes with a stern look, and she herself held onto the window frames with her hands, and her hair grew as if alive. In front of the girl was a large old tree, which majestically displayed a crown of branches and millions of green leaves. The girl began to confidently address the tree in front of her, asking about Claro and her mother. The tree responded by moving its leaves under the influence of the wind. The priestess began to listen to the story of the witness of the events. The tree began to tell the priestess something in her mind. Filia asks if it's not about what Claro is saying, and where are her moms? To which he answers, nearby, that is, she died. The adult priestess asks if the blonde has recently started behaving like this. The tree responds with its natural phenomena, 6 months ago. What prompted another question from the priestess? Who was Claro's mother? A metaphorical representation of the life of a person who was cut off from life and transferred his life to a vase in which he will not live long. The girl's eyes shone with curiosity and tension. The figure of a woman who looked like an impregnable tower, a white snow-covered mountain, was the daughter of an aristocrat who married early in order to ensure the life of her brothers and sisters. But life in the new family was not sweet, staring and alienation from new family members. She held her head helplessly. Over time, the girl coped and managed to get pregnant. But while she was carrying her daughter, the maids, like snakes, whispered to the woman that no one would like it if a son was born. The excited woman took this as attention. She was afraid that she would be returned home. While she was carrying the child, the husband, knowing about the pregnancy, visited his wife's friend, and therefore, during childbirth, she was almost alone, without support. When the woman woke up, she saw a crying child next to her. A girl was born, and she calmed her anxiety in her soul. He brought his hand closer to his daughter. The girl grabbed her little hand by the little finger. Tears appeared in the woman's eyes. She was touched. Filia was sitting on the windowsill like that. Her tears flowed from such a story, trying to be quieter in such a dark time. She covered her mouth with her hand. The woman loved her daughter very much, giving all her love to the child. She didn't let go of the opportunity to take her in her arms and just hug her. The two always had a smile on their face, but not for long. Over time, they were separated. Little by little, Filia tried to calm down, removing her hands from her face, but her tears still gave away sadness from such a sad story. The red-haired priestess was trembling with overflowing emotions, repeating Claire's name one after another, as if a mother were addressing her daughter. After a certain time, she put on her gold necklace with a shining diamond, became a little girl again. The priestess exhaled tiredly, hiding from the shining night sky to collect her thoughts. With her sleeve from her dress, she repeated, wiping her eyes from the tears that were still flowing. The little priestess sat down on the floor, leaning her back against the wall, tiredly exhaled. Bags under the eyes from insomnia and full of sadness. The girl moved away from her sadness, and they tried to wipe the traces of crying from the carpet. The girl found her rope that tied her hair in a ponytail. She began to braid her hair into a ponytail. The priestess carefully and calmly began to rise to her feet. The last time Filia asked the trees about that villa, she pointed with her finger at the white house that stood not far away, to which he replied that Claro's mother was gone. The girl quietly opened her door, gradually repeating certain details to herself, putting together a picture like a puzzle. Filia understood what was the matter, quietly walking out of the room along the corridor. The sky shone with billions of bright stones, and the moon illuminated with it. A young countess was sleeping in her bed, sweetly whispering to herself. Cleor awoke to the creaking of the balcony door, the night sky clearly showing a small dark shadow moving towards the owner of this room. The guest greeted the awakened Claro, who jumped up and asked in surprise who it was. In response, the guest began to speak, who was now leading adequately. A priestess entered the room through the balcony, and the countess recognized the guest. However, in response, she asked to stop these displays of psychos and malice, which should break the engagement. The fair-haired girl was in shock. Her plan was broken, so she could not say anything, only silently looked at the interlocutor. Filia repeated again that she would stop playing the role of the obsessive. But she could not answer, because she knew for sure that the priestess had bitten her. Talking to the tree, she asked about Claro, about her behavior. The tree replied that it was healthy. Filia, in an adult body, tried to wipe away traitorous tears, concluded that the girl was afraid that they would do the same as her mother. In Claro's room, putting all the puzzles together is a whole performance that should stop the engagement, but it won't help or it will be betrayed to someone else. The girl clenched her teeth, was angry because she did not know about her, to which Filia replied that she knows everything. In the vase, together with the rose, which stood longer and the petals were falling off, another rose, the same rose with a shorter trunk, was placed. Standing still, Filia said that she had brought something from her mother. Clear did not believe the guest, preparing to drive out on her own. But in response to the villa where she was accommodated and worried about her daughter, she was forced to calm down. The fair-haired beauty fell silent, remembering all those recent horrors. She remembered how she begged on her knees to help her mother because she was sick, but her stubborn father refused and told her that the servants were bothering her and to stop repeatedly begging for help. There was malice in his eyes and voice, and behind him were servants and relatives who looked down on the girl. She once again asked her brother for help, clutching her elbow in desperation, asked her to repeat asking her father from her face. But he refused to plead because it would be difficult for her to get married in the future. The last time I saw my mother, when a sick woman was being taken away, there was an order to isolate the woman from everyone. And the girl saw, tried to stop, but she herself was held by force. The first rose faded. After the funeral, the father is happy to announce the groom and to repeat the same fate as her mother. Even after the burial, the girl could not get over the pain and grief, and the announcement of the engagement began to frighten her. To the answer she heard from her father, she must obey him. Claro sat in front of the dresser, trying to see something in the reflection. She asked herself about herself. Who is she, or is she alive? A pale girl's face looked at her reflection with a sad look, waiting for an answer. But she found scissors from the shelf, and without taking her eyes off the mirror, the scissors approached her long blonde hair. Her hands were shaking from fear and pain, tears were flowing from her eyes, and the second rose was cut, the upper part. Claro asked how she knew everything, or maybe she learned it from the maids. Her voice trembled like her body, to which Filia calmly addressed by name. The girl's voice repeated the nicknames that her mother could not call in the past. The teenager seemed to calm down from this as she began to address herself. The red-haired priestess said in a calm voice that she did not want to interfere in their business if it were not for her mother. The short-haired girl calmly listened to the guest. Filia said in such a calm and confident tone that the mother wanted her daughter to be happy. Claro just remained silent, staring ahead, calming her rage. However, in the girl's soul, or happiness, which can be repeated in her, drove her into fear of the future and the possibility of repeating her mother's fate. Throughout the grave silence, Filia said that she was not always so unhappy, and for this she began to take out from her sleeve. She approached the girl. In front of the bed, she showed a letter, saying that Claro's mother was happy only with her. The teenager calmly listened to the priestess, looking at her hands. Filia put the letter on the girl's bed and left the room. Claro reached for the letter. Her tears began to flow down her cheeks again. The count's daughter pressed her mother's letter to her face, as if it were the last thing left after her mother. It was expensive for her. Filia looked back at the unfortunate girl. The morning came. A beautiful house lit up the bright sky. Around the house there were flattering comments towards Filia that the expectations were fulfilled, calling her a magician. The priestess was not very happy about such events and rumors. With a languid look after insomnia, she looked at the rejoicing people who recently did not believe the rumor and condemned the Angel of Roses. Happy Claro ran to meet Filia with the maids behind her. The blonde looked very happy, and her eyes shone with confidence and happiness. The priestess calmly turned to her, calmly smiled. However, the gossip, which I heard again from the maids, that the hostess came to herself as a miracle. Only Filia herself knew the truth about their mistress. And again, the conversation about the charms of the angel forced me to come to my senses and be indignant at my expectations. And the fact that they saw her coming to her at night made them turn to them completely, fearing that they could see how she could enter the villa. Today, the count met the priestess in a friendly and hospitable manner, as it should have been yesterday. However, knowing their hypocrisy and peaceful, quiet life without sermons, the mood remained indifferent, but I had to put a smile on my face. At breakfast, scrambled eggs, sandwiches, and sausages smelled appetizing on the plates. The count began to thank the priestess, asking how he should thank her. The rich man smiled and showed hospitality. And so did the little girl, savoring the porridge for her breakfast. But such a sudden change of mood made the priestess uncomfortable. They were so happy to be helped, but they themselves are to blame. They showed hospitality, which was disgusting, but as she chewed her food, she thought about the reward. And on her part, a decision was made that she did not want a reward from the count for saving his daughter, which he did not expect to hear, and looked at the guest in surprise. She demonstratively refused because of the service, which does not require an award, but she understood that the money would go to education. He again lit up with happiness. He was pleased to hear and see such useless help. He only asked to return to the monastery, in his mind to finally leave the city and not come. In response, he agreed to provide a carriage after breakfast. He commanded the servants sweetly, without any hesitation. At this reaction, Lily silently watched the count from the side, remembering his mood yesterday. Claro thanked the priestess, kneeling before her. She was happy with the received letter. Filia just watched the thanks in silence. In response to the future, she only shrugged her shoulders and answered that she had no idea. He continued his answer to the countess that one should simply live by making efforts. But they looked at the girl in surprise and only smiled. The little girl stood silently, not bothering to give help, but she herself did not hesitate to use her abilities for such help, out of her wishes. After breakfast, all the maids started waving handkerchiefs from the windows, saying goodbye to the guest with beaming smiles, believing in the girl's abilities. While the count's daughter looked calmly at the farewell of the maids, Fila's face did not express any joy, because in the future they will be invited again and burdened with business. Before she was ready to get into the carriage, Claro called her again. She stopped, turning to the blonde. She whispered something to the red-haired girl. I asked that if he meets his mother, he will have to pass on the words. While everyone looked at it in amazement without a clue, the redhead realized that, like everyone else, she believed her magic and only silently listened to the request. But she asked to convey to her mother that she will be happy. It was an ordinary request, but it surprised the priestess. Her eyes widened. The gaze fell on the calm Clear, who was removing her hand to herself. Filia silently smiled and thereby seemed to agree. The wind blew from the side, made the petals fly like birds. Everyone stood quietly, silently saying goodbye. Only a voice from nowhere told Filia that she heard everything. The girl raised her eyes to the sky, wondering. It was as if it was strange and scared the little priestess. She kept looking up. She got into the carriage, waved goodbye through the window, and everyone behind the window said goodbye to her. But the eyes were still so big. Lying down completely on the seat, covering herself with a blanket, she tried to calm down and forget the incident. She lay silently and tried to understand about that incident before leaving. The landscape outside the window was changing, but the weather remained sunny and warm. When she arrived at her destination, the coachman helped her out of the carriage. She stepped silently on the ground. She kept trying to look up and understand what she heard then. A brown-haired girl was looking at the sky with hope, and a dark-haired boy was lying in her arms. And Filia looks at the endless blue sky with the same look. The horses that drove the carriage stood and made their characteristic sounds. Warm sunny day in the forest. Someone addressed the priestess while the carriage was standing still. When they addressed her again, she seemed to have come back from her thoughts. The coachman turned to her as she was silent. She just turned her head unhappily and asked what? But she was silent, like him. The silence was broken only by the sound of the girl's stomach rumbling. She replied that she was hungry, but the coachman calmed down and was ready to leave. The gray-haired coachman was turning back, waving his head in farewell. This time, Filia said goodbye to the coachman, not understanding why he was doing it. As soon as he left, she calmly lowered her hand, plunging into her thoughts, and along her familiar path to the monastery, she began to walk forward, only to hear a call from the forest thickets. The castle was so alienated, covered in darkness from the night, stood in the dark, thorny thickets. The officer was given orders to summon a priest to their town while the prince was on his way. The excited officer turned to the prince, a little afraid of him. But he didn't want to hear anything, didn't stop, so the officer kept quiet. He stood behind, looking back, and was afraid of the prophecy that everything was approaching their kingdom. It was a warm, sunny morning, which illuminated the monastery. Filia in the monastery explained what the count's problem was to the tutor. While she was still talking about her case at the sermon, the headmistress listened silently. The girl remembered that white letter with a seal that was waiting to be given. And then I remembered how everything became easier. In my memory, on the last day when I was visiting, I remembered that happy face of Claro, wishing her to live happily. However, due to the fact that it was necessary to intervene, Filia took hold of the sternum, grabbing the necklace that was under it, and the redhead fell silent for a certain time. The woman took the child's shoulders and repeated her task of comforting her, and everything else was their responsibility. The nun repeated that this is the work of the guide, but also praised her for her work. The girl liked the praise, looking into the woman's eyes, from which a blush appeared, and her eyes shone. Encouraged, Filia smiled and said that this was the last time she would make such visits. In response, she only praised. The conversation continued in the priest's office. He stated the problem. The woman asked what. Filia pretends to rub her sapphire eyes from tears. The little pet just stretched her hand forward, pointed her index finger at someone, and then looked back. The man sat in the same place and drank black tea. He heard everything. However, the girl calls him an illusion, and he smiled sweetly and praised the pet. She gets more and more angry, says that the illusion is appealing to her. He playfully said that he expected this and was impressed. Filia was more annoyed by his personality. Out of fury, she declared that he was mocking her and could read everything that he was thinking. Her eyes sparkled. She stood still, trying to read his thoughts. Everything around fell silent. She read something again that made her eyes widen, and the priest watched her reaction. The redhead repeated what she had done, but asked why he wanted her dead. He replied that he did not want to. However, she dissatisfiedly said that he was using her. The priest put the tea on the table and said that these departures were a test. The branch was shocked, but in a negative way, about these departures. She lowered herself a little, exhaled, and said that she was not worried about her and the consequences. But the priest's voice changed, that everything changes, and the girl's eyes turned to him in surprise. The Supreme gives the task to find the prince who is preparing a rebellion. The girl watched in silence. With a stern look and tone, he orders the prince to stop. Lily was completely speechless. Sunny day. The clear weather gave warmth to the flowers in the garden after the rain. The sun's rays warmed the frozen black tea. He repeated about the prince's prophecies, and the girl promptly repeated the prophecy. In a calm tone, she told about the prophecy from the prophet, which is considered a curse that everyone knows. He asked where the prince was. In response, the pet nodded, as a sign of response. The male figure with a bloody sword and corpses around him is the cursed prince. The cold blue of the void with red puddles from blood and a red sky. On the wasteland, there is a castle engulfed in darkness, and everything around is overgrown with thorns. All three remembered the prophecy in which the prince tries to destroy the countries. The sun began to set behind the horizon. The story is more about the prince. She learns that he is threatening her father, and everyone is sure that the spirit of revenge resides in that. The girl silently looked at the priest. However, she began to laugh uncertainly. Feeling bad, she understood that he wanted to kill, sending on such a task, and grabbed the headmistress's dress. She screams out of rage and fear that she is not ready to die. But the gray-haired man thought, she refuses, that revenge is not without reason, but it is dangerous." The nun looked at the frightened girl. Filia covertly stamped her feet at this, but he silently got up from his chair, saying that he did not want to talk about it and she had to stop the chaos. The priest got up from his chair and walked towards the girl, still talking about the task, and she was trembling with fear. He sat down on one knee, at the girl's eye level. Filia was trembling and holding on to the woman's dress. He asked, "What does she care about the lives of those people?" He was still staring at her sternly. Lily believed the words, but felt uneasy. Her hands were shaking as she held on to the woman. The headmistress felt her fear, but stood silently. Out of rage, the angel bit her delicate lip. Filia ran into the room, slamming the door behind her, and heard curses in his direction. The adults just sighed. On the street, it began to slowly fall into the evening. In the evening, the nun knocked on the door, behind which the upset girl was still sitting. The nun asks to open the door, offering food. She held a tray with a sandwich and a glass of water in her hands. She opened the door with a sad look. The woman was surprised that she quickly opened it. Due to the long absence of food, the girl stretched and looked with a greedy, hungry look, stretching her arms. The room began to slowly fill with a shadow from the wall, but the sandwich was delicious. The redhead quickly ate a delicious sandwich, cursing the priest and his task. A woman sat next to her and listened to her. While she hurriedly ate, the girl asked whose side she was on and did she know about it. To which she gave a short no. The woman replied that she knew she could read it in her mind and by looking. The girl ate everything and was indignant. The girl repeated negative thoughts, which the director suggested she think about herself. The dark-haired one fell silent until she started talking about Akansar while the red-haired one ate a sandwich. And silence reigned between them again. It became dark outside. The woman turned to the student again, repeating about the work of the priests. The girl sadly replied that this matter was very serious and she would not be able to handle it, while the woman replied that she would do what she could. But Lily turns to the woman and answers in a frightened voice that she is not ready to take such responsibility. The sandwich is almost finished, but she stopped eating and tried to justify her failure on this task. She turned to herself, bent forward a little, and repeated that she did not want to help. The older nun turned to the girl, telling her that not everyone is capable of playing the role of a god. The girl turned to her in surprise. However, she mentioned the powers that are given to Filia, gifts that have their own role. Lily looked down. Tears began to flow. The older woman took the mug and put it on the table. She told her decision to let Filia go. She felt uneasy, but raised the girl's gaze to her. A speechless silence passed between them in the room as they looked at each other. The headmistress only repeated her best efforts. Filia looked at the caring woman. However, the girl's gaze fell and the room became dark. In the morning, the gray-haired priest saw her and asked if she had calmed down. But she looked at him maliciously, and he waved his hand sweetly. She looked away, calling him names in a voice he heard. He started to get up when he heard the answer to the trip. She kept growling, crossed her arms on her chest, and he tried to understand what he just heard. He looked at the headmistress in surprise, that no matter how she persuaded her, the girl was blowing on him. The priest sat back and heard a question in his direction from the pupil, with whom he would go. However, he said that he could not. She looked at the supreme with a surprised look, but he playfully replied, nodding his head, that he would go with someone else. He stood up and again heard the question from the girl with whom she would go. He spoke briefly to Dieta. The girl fell silent in surprise. He was ready to leave, and again heard the same question about the traveling companion, answering the same thing. Surprised, the girl turned to him. I remembered the blonde boy. A handsome boy in a light suit and a black sweater looked at the scenery. Filia felt uneasy about who she would go with. A carriage drove along the forest steps. Nature woke up from the night. The birds met again and began to chirp, and the stream was bubbling with activity. Filia sat and silently waited for someone. And the carriage arrived and heard a familiar voice. Massive brown boots stepped out of the carriage onto the green grassy glade. The man exhaled. A handsome boy came up to Lily, calling him by the nickname he was ashamed of. Why is it noisily asking to stop calling it that? The horses stood there, rustling among themselves. Didi's brother began to caress Lily as if with a small child, which annoyed her and asked her not to touch him. Diati smiled sweetly, removed his hand from the girl's head. In the light of the morning, Diadi turned to Lily. He offered to play up, but she angrily refused and was ready to hit him. He playfully stroked the girl on the way to the monastery, to which she angrily asked not to be touched. He looked at her sweetly, as if she were a little girl, but because of her hidden age and his character, she felt angry, but also ashamed. Monks met them near the building, and the boy greeted them. The priest smiled back, but the woman raised her eyes in silence. She saw a handsome young man in front of her, whom she imagined to be somewhat different. The guy paid attention to the woman who was looking at him, but froze without any emotion. He was beaming with happiness. She looked very thoughtfully at the guest, while the priest smiled and was happy to meet him. Behind Diadi was Filia, very red, but the girl turned her head away so as not to show her red cheeks and displeasure. The girls walked forward in silence, while the boys discussed the upcoming trip and the situation among themselves. They entered the monastery from the bright courtyard. The boy asked the Verkhovna what case Lily was needed for, to which he laughed and replied that it was a secret. Unsatisfied, Lily walked away from the men and the woman, while everyone was discussing the same thing in the study room, walking together. Dwisti looked surprised first at the Supreme and then at Filia. She tried not to react and looked away. Daiti addressed her by her nickname, which made her jump up and get angry, flipping to stop calling her that. Lily turned back, but they seemed not to notice her and their shyness. However, the boy was surprised to listen to the girl's task. Verkhovny took the young man by the shoulder and asked him to protect him. And in response, he nods, agreed. The guy understood why it would be difficult, after which he would expect a promotion. Scratching the back of his head, the man just calmly looked at the interlocutor. Everyone in the building was surprised at such a promotion that Filia jumped out to them. A map on which there are points of cities called flowers or plants. From a sweet, kind boy on the battlefield, the young man became a tough fighter who is brave and not easy tasks to promote. She was shocked by such news and tried to understand why he would have to accompany him and thus get a higher status. However, he calmly questioned the pupil, to which she answered yes. She looked at him with round eyes, having learned about the great death from the prince. However, he smiled calmly. The priest left so as not to hear the girl's displeasure again. He did not stop smiling at Lily, as if it was simple, and did not panic, because it is possible to die on the way. The redhead froze in fear. The girl was shocked, and all the others didn't seem to care. And it was warm and clear outside. The sky was light blue, which was covered by tree branches, and the sun was warm and the light was clear. The forest path was deserted and quiet. The roses opened under the sun's rays. Filia was grabbed by the vagina from behind, that she had a serious look. Lily was again escorted to the carriage for the task, and Diadi held the whole time. And behind them accompanied the priest and the headmistress with the student's suitcase. Filia tried to escape to the escorts through the window, but her defender grabbed the collar of the dress and prevented her from escaping. She sadly accepted her difficult fate and the impossibility of escaping from the strong hands of the boy, and the monks caught her behind. For the last time, she again began to complain about the priest who sends her on difficult tasks, as if to death. But he calmly listened to all this. However, he was surprised by her tears. She began to cry in sadness, not understanding why she would send a child to danger and want to kill her. She turned to the headmistress, looking at the roses, so that she would remember her how she would look at the roses. The woman understood what had been recorded and remained silent. However, the child's sadness did not subside. He tiredly looks at the whims of the girl until a question was heard from her. Does he really think that this is the person from the prophecy? He only briefly agreed, walking behind under the clear, bright sky. But another question arose in which the Lord definitely wants to stop the prophecy. And everyone stopped, surprised. But she smiled slyly. He seemed to neglect to stop the prophecy, while the girl's face had a sly smile. But she asked in shock, why go there? The nun was walking behind. He approached the girl, who was being held, but calmly explained that she only wanted to eat and live alone. The gray-haired man could not understand such a decision and way of life. While they were walking to the prepared carriage, Filia still did not want to go, but she wanted more time for this. But again, refusal. Both young people looked at the Supreme, because the prince was already ready to advance. The birds chirped sweetly on the tree. Sometimes we listened to the conversation of people below. The priest explained that the prince was waiting for her, but with a playful voice and a smile, The priest said that I was waiting for her. She felt sick. Everyone came closer to the carriage, but the girl kept asking why they were waiting for her. The priest answered that a sermon was needed before the start of the war. The gray-haired priest calmly answered that it is not necessary to know about the holding of the memorial service, that Lily still did not understand. She needs to stop the rebellion, came the answer. The Supreme One waved his finger, but answered without panic that she was safe with deity. However, she looked at the grandfather in disbelief. Verkhovny took the girl from the boy's hands and was ready to throw her into the carriage with a sweet smile. He threw the girl inside the carriage and closed the door from the side, preventing the evil pet from escaping. And deity said goodbye to the nun. Lily opened the window of the door, but it revealed a scroll of sacred writing. She got angry and cursed. He hands over the manuscript, along with his head in the carriage, and in front, the elder brother sat down to the horses. The carriage left its place in the middle of the night, so suddenly that you could hear screams from the carriage. The priest and the nun waved. The carriage moved very quickly until the dust rose, and from the carriage bad words were heard in the direction of the high priest. The carriage began to drive slowly under the warm autumn weather. It was quiet all around, except for the stomping of hooves and the screeching of wheels. Deity understood that quietly, after leaving the monastery, he felt uneasy and turned to his friend. Turning again, she was insulted and asked to be silent and had no desire to talk to him. He looked through the window into the carriage. She bent down and covered her face. She was upset. He just smiled. The carriage then stopped at lunchtime. The boy held out the cake. She only looked up at the offered cake.
In response, she showed 2 fingers and repeated the same voice. Both were sitting on a stone. Filia was eating a pie, and he was watching her eat.
To dilute the warm autumn silence, she asked her brother Didi how much more to go. After eating 1 piece of pie, the companion replied that it would be a few days. She asked with curiosity about the situation with the road, which is blocked due to the rebellion, and the road attendant answered that. She tried to understand why they were going over to the prince's side, that he was responding because of his faith in him. With red cheeks, she went back to eating the cake and understanding the prince. I remembered the words of the Supreme about indifference to people. She denied it. She was not indifferent to people's lives. Eats his cake. Suddenly, the boy's palm rested on the girl's head. Deity stroked the girl's head, expecting a negative response from her. But she turned her head in his direction, and he smiled, tried to comfort her. He continued to speak to think about the solution to this task, but Filia was confused, stopping to eat a piece of pie. He carefully looked at his companion, noticing their pensive appearance. She only answered calmly to the best of her ability. And he went off topic. He said about the pie. She blushed. Filia continued to eat her piece of pie because Deity says that she still has a long way to go. However, she added silently with red cheeks while he reassured her that she would be safe. Chewing on her pie, the redhead asked about integrity and safely, when possible like that. He just calmly looked at her. After such a question, he himself began to wonder why she felt sick and stopped eating. He just calmly answered that if the bones are invisible there, then they will be there. The girl was more than worried. He answered as a joke, which made her angry. They were all sitting on the fireplace in the autumn forest. A warm sun was setting, followed by night. The carriage began to accelerate sharply. The horses pulled the carriage with force, and the coachman became tense. Arrows began to fly at the carriage, which hit behind the wall of the carriage. Filia was scared and leaned against the door, panicking. And from the front, Deity asked Lily to move to the front inside the carriage. In a panic and leaning against the window, they questioned the rector, whom he had promised. He calmly promised, and will keep it. Out of anger, she shouted that she was worried about him and stopped being so happy. However, the boy only smiled. The horizon was getting warmer because the sun was going to sleep. The carriage drove past the camp, which was preparing for the cold night. Those who were behind the carriage paid attention to the transport. Filia prayed from the chase that followed the carriage. The horses stampeded, unable to stop. This time, Deity's face changed. He was busy grooming the horses, and horsemen with arrows ran after them. Archers fired arrows into the carriage from a long distance. Little by little, the arrows flew either under the wheels or hit the walls of the carriage. The boy looked away. Not far behind them, horsemen pursued. The coachman turned to Lily to climb over to him in order to get rid of the conspicuous carriage. She was cornered, closer to him, surprised by such an idea. He broke the glass of the window, asking about the importance of things, to which she answered no. He turned to her and began to draw until she glanced at the scroll. Filia took the scroll and began to cut it with the boy's help. He took it in his arms and jumped out of his vehicle. The red-haired priestess was resting on his shoulder, and he was sitting on one of the freed carriage horses. Drawing a saber from its scabbard, Diadi cut the straps, stopped the carriage, and freed the other horse. But she looked tiredly at all this, lazily on the boy's shoulders. He only thought that this would stop the persecution. The carriage drove back, blocking the thieves' path, but some did not stop. They bypassed the carriage. Filia noticed this and warned the companion who was looking ahead. She noticed with surprise that they wanted things, and still they were trying to catch up with them. The boy's gaze shifted to the riders, then he asked his companion to sit on his back, which she did not expect. And the arrows are ready to fly again. She sat on his back, but she screamed in fear that arrows were flying. She realized that they could hit her. Diadi's gaze was stern and brave. He turned his back forward, and he himself repelled the attack of the arrows. He watched the next attack while the girl cried and held her back in fear. The new attack was repelled again, surprising Lily with such speed and skill in fending off arrows. She held on to him. She could not believe that the young man had such an ability. He looked up and tried to understand why, and he noticed how those horsemen began to retreat back. He turned back to where the army company was heading in their direction. These were soldiers waiting for Angel Rose. They both calmed down more or less. The horse slowed down towards the army. Lily was so happy that they were alive that she cried. He just exhaled. The army was waiting for them both, holding torches to light the way, and the flag boasted a coat of arms with a lion holding a sword. Diadi carefully turned to Filia, who was trying to move away from the terrible chase that had arrived in one piece.
However, she was smiling so joyfully while the rider was smiling sweetly at the defenders.
For which she cursed him, and he laughed. The soldiers began to lead to the castle. The morning came, and then the darkness receded, and we saw the white castle. Filia was sleeping under the boy's clothes, and only the boy's voice began to wake him up. She sat straight on the horse. He replied that they had already arrived. Rubbing his eyes, the sapphire eyes looked up. In front of him were huge stone walls, gates, above which hung the coat of arms of the prince. She just silently looked up. The maid silently looked at where she had come, and he replied that it was not easy to go here. The girl's eyes did not move away from the gate. She just kept silent. The door opened. The companion asked the priestess if she could pray, to which she agreed, answering that the prayer could be the last, that Diada was a little upset by her distrust of him. Behind the gate stood the assistant of the prince, who was waiting for the guests. A horseman came out of the castle to the guests, while the army saluted. Both young men looked ahead. He asked his soldiers where the priest was. They were uncertainly silent until they looked at those who were driving. One of the soldiers replied that it was a little girl. The commander could not understand a little, but he paid attention to the guests and was loudly surprised. Filia tried to get out from under the cape. The dark-haired commander looked at them in surprise. She looked out from under Diathy's cape with a lovely, radiant look, and he was more and more shocked. For a while, the army commander was silent, trying to come to his senses. He looked at the girl, tried to understand that she was the priestess they were waiting for. She calmly looked at the commander. The eyes shone with sapphire again. He connected the ability to read thoughts, realized that he was not a prince. Why look indignantly at the guests? Then the commander gave the order to take her to the castle, silently turned away from the girl and her bodyguard. From answered the soldier's words that he was a priest, and again the order to lead the guests. He looked again at the girl with the rider. He looked at them in disbelief, while Lily could not see the commander's look. The horses stampeded, went where the rider led. Guests of the city entered the city. The girl silently looked up. Knights were standing at the gates, but today they were watching the priestess. The dawn was just breaking. The guests came to the city under the guard of soldiers. The girl's eyes were directed forward while Diadi looked around. The light began to pass through the gloomy clouds. People came out to look at the foreigners. Filia felt uneasy, bit her lip. The riders approached the prince's castle, which looked like a church, a bright building with stained glass windows. Inside the building, the guards stood at their posts, but everything was gray and dark, although the sunlight penetrated and added brightness to the walls. Filia looked around, noticed the difference between the atmosphere and the appearance outside and inside. The soldiers of the city followed them. The girl looked at everything, noticed that she did not see women in the castle. Suddenly, Filia's thoughts were interrupted by the voice of a soldier who said that the prince was gone and would take her to her room. The girl was tired from the trip. She beamed with happiness, until Diady's voice emphasized that one room would be enough. The soldier was silent, and she froze in a stupor. The guy explained that she should be under close control in a foreign city. Lily was in shock, turned her head to the companion. She snarled in displeasure, turned completely towards him, and was against it. He was beaming with joy as never before, smiling like a child. She silently cried for herself. She could not object. She cried bitterly in her heart, because she wanted to be alone. And everyone around noticed that the guy was right, that she is small and needs to be protected. Her feelings seemed to have left her. Her gaze was depressed. Filia and Diady were brought to their room. She stood all so sad, lowered her gaze to the floor, and they were left to rest and then be served food. She came to herself, looked up. Everything around was beautiful, but abandoned. There were very few guests in the castle. The mirror was slightly broken, and certain pieces of furniture were all covered with rags. In his imagination, the dark room was filled with most of the guests talking about their own. And now expensive furniture is covered with white and gray fabrics. In her thoughts, she stood still, until Brother Diady turned to the priestess, asking about her well-being, because of the fact that she stood still so silently. The soldier was still standing at the entrance, and the guest of the castle turned to him and asked when the prince would arrive. He answered that at noon, because he was hunting wolves. He explained that black wolves live in the forest around the city, which could reveal their secrecy only with their eyes. She only smiled uncertainly, remembering the peculiarity of the city. The sun rose higher and higher, illuminating the horizon of the desert beyond the city. There were many people in the hall, dancing under a beautiful chandelier that illuminated the whole room. Guests could either dance or talk among themselves. Beautiful classical music was playing in the hall. The eyelids lifted up, Lily's sapphire eyes fell asleep again. She seemed to have moved to the hall. He stood surprised in the middle of the hall. No one noticed the presence of the priestess. On the wall hung the banner of the prince on the wall, an eagle with a coat of arms and hanging crosses, holding swords in its paws, and there were thorns around the animal. The priestess noticed, turned her gaze to the side. Everywhere in the hall a crowd of girls surrounded the prince. She looked deeply from her seat, until the boy's back, in the crowd of girls, began to turn back. A dark-haired boy with very beautiful blue eyes looks as if at them. Diady's hand touched Lily. He tried to wake the girl up. The girl opened her eyes while lying in her bed and saw Diady standing over her and looking excitedly at the priestess. He excitedly asked about his well-being and perhaps feared the horrors. However, she stood up, wiping her eyes. She remembered a dream where the prince's beautiful blue eyes were shining and looking at her. I pretended to myself that it was not like a dream, but like memories. She looked ahead, noticed that she saw someone's specific memories. I remembered that commander, about the possibility of his memories. She asked her brother about the time. He replied that it was 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and the room became brighter. Lady sat down on the bed, began to tie her hair in a ponytail. He worriedly told her to rest, but she refused. Sounds were heard from the window. Diady looked out the window, saw how the horsemen of the prince, who went hunting, returned with livestock, but she noticed what he said about game. That is, the prince returned to the castle. There was a knock on the door of the guest room. They turned their eyes to the door that opened for them. The commander, who met in the morning and introduced himself as the prince's assistant, called Himas, came to the room. He put his hand to his chest as a mark of respect. Filia moved closer to him. The man's gaze was fixed on the guest, but she herself turned on her gift of reading Himas's soul. A tall, dark-haired man dressed in blue clothing. Only a few ornaments were on his uniform. Himas looked away excitedly to tell her something in secret. He looked back at the priestess, who was still reading the soul, until he came closer and bent down to her eye level. He informed that he knew from the high priest, in a whisper, with a secretiveness. She understood that the Supreme had warned about her. She remembered that first meeting, which was unexpected for her. She looked away, annoyed, remembering the gray-haired mentor. He looks at her reaction in a stupor. The girl's sapphire eyes turned to the prince's assistant, and tears of happiness flowed from his eyes. Lily looked up at the mountain out of anger, because even the prince's assistant believed in the myth of the Rosé Angel, and he was still beaming with happiness. She looked at him again, worried about the effect of such a secret meeting between the assistant and the priest behind the prince's back. Kimus looks no longer as before, but more sternly and coolly. A high-pitched smile appeared on the bench. Lily remembered the gray-haired mentor, irritably considering the latter's thinking about the prince's concessions. Kimus began to take the guest to the castle on his own, excitedly asked to change the prince's mind. Lily thought about the possibility of helping. Her gaze was calm. The prince was sitting in the throne room, waiting for the priestess, looking ahead with a proud smile, crossed his legs, sat on the throne confidently. The guests followed the prince's assistant to the throne room. In front of the door stood the assistant with the guests of the castle. Everyone was silently preparing to meet the master of the castle. Hymus tells the guests that the prince is waiting here, and there was only silence between them. Filia only nodded in agreement. They began to open the door in front of the girl, through which sunlight shone. Her gaze was confident. The prince's fingers, stained with blood, nervously tapped the handle of the throne. The prince's voice sounded surprised, because there had been no guests in the castle for a long time. Behind the throne, the rays of the sun tried to illuminate the hall, but the chair was dim. The girl froze in place, staring ahead with glassy eyes. She was not so close, but in front of the throne on which the prince was sitting, and his assistant was standing next to him. She felt the predator's cool gaze on her. The prince sat in place, haughtily looking at the guest, and his eyes, which mocked with a blue glow. Anxiety panicked inside the girl because she saw him in a dream. She remembered those memories in which she saw a woman with a boy. The boy's eyes were still fixed on his guest. Anxiety still reigned inside the maid. Her heart fluttered with fear. She could not say anything. The prince sat on the throne, waiting for an answer from her. He looked up and down like that. The girl's mouth opened, but she began to pronounce the first letter of the alphabet louder and louder. Finally, she put her hands on her head and screamed. Everyone was alarmed. It was daylight outside, and a sound from the throne room could be heard outside. The guards at the door were surprised by the screams, and the prince himself did not expect such a reaction. Everyone looked at the priest's student in surprise. Even Diati paid attention to her. Filia covered her mouth with her hand, because she herself was not expecting it. A guard stood outside and questioned them about the strange sound. Out of excitement, the maid put her leg back. She looked at the floor, because she seemed ashamed of such behavior, but she could not understand why. An ordinary prince with charcoal hair, who was looking tiredly to the side and holding a sword at the ready. Leo Elyon, the prince of the castle, sat still. The girl looked up. She sighed heavily, blue eyes that devoured her. But the mood changed a little. He became stern and dissatisfied. He looked tiredly at Filia. Filia turned her head to the side, which the prince did not like. Prince Elliot coldly addressed the little guest, but she trembled with fear and remained silent. Her escort from the church turned to her himself. They both answered the prince, introduced themselves to him. The prince sighed tiredly. She did not expect an answer. She looked in surprise at the owner of the castle, who stood up from the throne and began to come closer to her. Elliot moved closer to Filia, but she looked down in fear. The prince's hand grabbed the girl's chin, lifted it up. He directly asked everyone, looking at the girl, whom he raised his head up, why did they send the child? She looked at him anxiously and remained silent, but he did not take his eyes off her, waiting for an explanation. The atmosphere was tense. Eyes were fixed on each other. His hands were still holding the girl's head, and he directly asked the guest what she answered to declare war, which was the task given by the high priest. And there was silence again. The eyes kept on each other. Lily's hands clutched her dress, clenched in fear. Trying to calm himself down, he metaphorically represents the key to the secret buried in the underwater depths. Filia closed her eyes, trying to calm herself. Prince Elliot stood still, his hands free from the hem of his dress. Leo Elyon looked surprised at the reaction of the guest, who was holding his delicate face tightly with his hand, and began to tremble again. The prince tore his hand from her head, raised it above himself, and greeted the guest with indifference, returned that haughty look at the first meeting. He asked Hymas to prepare the soldiers 4 days before the ritual. The girl clutched her hands to her chest in fear and remained silent. The prince's aide agreed, although he was alarmed and turned his gaze to Lily, expecting her to help end the war. His hands were shaking, he was clutching his dress. She breathed louder, Her eyes turned away in fear. He did not expect such silent consent from the high priest's student, but the prince repeated that the ritual would soon take place in 4 days. Leo Elyon turned to face Filia. He extended his hand to her. In a kinder tone, he extended his hand to her, as if in agreement. But Lila lost the gift of speech, holding on to her clothes. Hymas was calling very loudly in the guest room, to which Lily and Diadi returned. The girl was lying on the couch, face down. Lily lifted her head up, looked at the nervous assistant of the prince, who was waiting for an answer about the decision. But the maid only turned her head to the side. However, Lily began to wonder about the prince's prophecy. In the throne room, the prince extended his hand to the girl. The gloves were covered in blood. The girl looked at her hand in fear and turned her head away, unable to say a word to him. He paid attention to what frightened the maid and tried to calm her down with his high-pitched tone while they brought the basin of water. The prince took off his gloves and began to wash his fingers from the blood soaked in the gloves. After washing, he began to shake off the remaining water. Leo Elyon approached her again, turned his head. The boy stretched his wet hand over the girl's head. She was expecting something bad. Elliot's hand just rested on the girl's head, caressing the frightened girl. However, it did not reassure her. She still felt fear. He bent down to her, stroked her head, and said that he would be careful to make her feel comfortable. She was angry at the way he was treating her now. And out of rage, she removed her hand to the side, raised her angry eyes a little confidently. She decided to try to read his soul again by looking at him. The prince did not expect such a reaction. He looked at the guest in surprise. The eyes again began to shine with a sapphire shade, but darker. Prince Leo looked at her while reading his soul. He stood calmly, looking up and down. There was so much negativity coming from him. Before him, Lily felt fear, like a cornered victim before a predator. Lily, in her room, looked ahead angrily, trying to understand what was wrong with the prince. The girl's thoughts were interrupted by the call of Hymas. When she came to, she turned her attention to the men, and she turned to Diathy, while Hymas stomped his feet on the floor, waiting for something else. She pointed a finger at the prince's assistant, ordering her companion to lead her uncle out of the room. He is no less surprised than Diathy. A warm autumn day stood on the horizon of the castle. Hymas was returning to his office, and the guards noticed the disappointed commander. In the room, Lily sat angrily on her bed with a pillow. Out of rage, she began to tear the pillow to pieces, lifted it above herself. He lowered the pillow under him. She looked down and couldn't understand why her powers didn't work, and she started torturing the pillow again. Having calmed down a little, Diathy sat down next to his companion, holding a pillow under his arm and stroking the girl's shoulders with his free hand. Filia turned to him, asking in a huff, to which he looked at her in surprise. She replied that it was about the prince. He thoughtfully looked up, answering that it was not an easy task. She sat in silence, realizing that she was simply considering everything. She clutched the white bedclothes with rage, discussing what she was about that difficult meeting with the prince. And then she turned her head to the interlocutor. After a not-so-long pause, while the sun stood outside the window, Filia asked the guard if he had killed anyone. The boy was surprised by such a question. There was sadness in the girl's eyes, and she asked about the permissibility of such a question. He denied it and began to think about it, looking ahead. Diathy calmly answered, turned his gaze to the little companion, that there were such cases. But she is interested, looking at him, about the number. He fell silent because it was uncomfortable. She looked at the calm Didi, thinking about the difference between the prince and him. The boy's eyes were fixed on the interviewer. The maid looked down. She noticed how calm it was in her voice. There was silence in the conversation between them. Diathy looks at the priest's student, waiting for some order or question for him. She remembered those blue eyes, the eyes of the prince from the first meeting in which Leo Elyon sat on his throne. Filia exhaled. She again turned to Diathy, offering to go back. At first there was silence between them, but he asks if she is joking. However, Lily calmly replied that she was serious. He answers with uncertainty that the prince will not let him go. And because of this, Filia flared up with anger, because it is difficult to give such a task to a child. She was lying on the bed, tears flowing from her eyes. She asked her interlocutor again, and he answered with consent. And she began to knit again. The little priestess remembered the high priest and cursed. Diathy tried to calm down, because the maid was ready to tear the pillow. A hand hit the table. Hymas thought excitedly that everything was gone. His eyes reflected both anger and despair from the war that would soon follow. The girl rushed to sleep in her bed in order to calm down and at least put aside her negative thoughts and bad day. Kimas in his office, dropping to one knee, covered his despair, tears of fear with his hand. In a dream, in broad daylight, someone was calling the prince. The little prince turned to the voice, Himas's voice, with a happy face. Filia's eyes opened sharply, sapphire eyes shining after the dream. She woke up, got out of bed, and tried to understand what she just saw in her dream. Leaves from green trees began to fall from the wind. Lily looked up, felt sadness. And Hymus himself restrained his negative feelings, biting his lips so that no one could hear him. Filia sat on the bed, began to cry herself after dreams caused by pain and sadness. In an indifferent tone, the maid fell on the bed, began to justify her decision, that she was young for such a decision. Diadi tried to explain. The priest's student furiously continued to beat the pillow with her hand, desperately talking about herself that she could not and would not do. Filia's eyes have become empty, a dark blue shade, does not express any emotions or signs of life. The redhead turned back to see her teacher staring at her. A nun appeared behind Filia. He recalled the woman's words before leaving. The look was fixed on the teacher. She turned to the woman's voice, but the high priest and the head mistress of the monastery were standing behind her. She tried to make excuses that she couldn't. From the side, Filia heard her voice criticizing her excuse. She turned her head, seeing herself. The copy's eyes were a different shade, and she was smiling. First, Lily began to explain that the ability does not work on him. Lily's friend looks thoughtful and asks about other possibilities. A copy of Filia's finger touched the other's breast, trying to lower her self-confidence and mind-reading. She came closer and mockingly said that she was also human. Filia began to cover her ears in her sleep, trying not to listen to the other Filia in her head. Suddenly his eyes became bigger. He remembered another dream. Filia remembered the dream where the prince stood surrounded by people who were fascinated by him. A look with a happy smile from Elliot. Then she remembered the current Arrow Elliot, who was smiling maliciously and arrogantly. She was lying on the bed, thinking about something, and a smile appeared on his face. The girl was lying on her bed, with a certain peace of mind to fall asleep. In her dream, Filia was sitting under a tree, as if falling asleep. Unintentionally, she heard a rustling above her, raised her head up. Elliot was sitting on a branch, and a bird was sitting on his finger and chirping at him. The boy listened to the bird with delight, brought his head a little closer to the feathered interlocutor. Filia stood up, looking at the prince who was sitting on the branch above her. Tears began to flow again in her surprised eyes. Arrow Elliot sat in the same place, the branches of an apple tree. One hand brought the bird closer to him, kissed its beak, the other held on to a tree. Filia looked at the happy prince, tried to understand the strange warm feelings that she could not feel before, and someone started calling and running up. The boy stuck out his tongue and said that he could fall from fear. In response, the assistant growled at the boy, but Lily laughed at the funniness of both. Hymus looks nervously at the prince until he starts to slide out of his seat. The assistant looked scared, preparing to grab his master. The commander's hands are stretched upward to catch. There was fear and care in his eyes at the same time. The hair was hanging up and down, and the leaves of the apple tree were still falling. The boy was holding onto the branch with his legs, his hands, body, and hair were hanging down. Hima's hands go up above his head in shock. The brunette stuck out his tongue at the man again. The boy was hanging up and down and taunting the concerned assistant, trying to recover from his fear. The prince returned to his place, still taunting the man, until Filia reminded him from the side. The boy bent a little, happily asked Himas about the opportunity to have some more fun, and a white bird sat on his shoulder. The eyes shone with a saffron glow. She woke up. She stood up, surprised, and tried to remember what she had seen. The young prince, who was still joyful. She raised her head sadly, remembering this dream. Filia began to cry from the pain she felt after sleeping. He covered his sad eyes behind his little hands, lying in his bed. It was dark outside the window. Someone came to the office of the prince's assistant, and he asked what was the matter. And there stood Diadi, who lowered his eyes. Kimas, who did not want to speak, asked the guests again in annoyance. Diadi answered that the maid had sent, standing at the door. Filia's companion stepped back a little to show the maid who had visited the prince's assistant. However, she was hiding behind Didi's brother. The owner of the room did not expect such a visit, so he fell silent and was puzzled. Lily's maid kept holding on to Diadi, tears welling up in her eyes. Kima stood still, unable to understand her mood this time. He asked the boy with his gaze, but he understood the question and only turned his head from side to side. And Filia interrupted his speech, forcing everyone present in the room to pay attention while holding back tears. That picture of a happy prince sitting on a tree with an army commander under him flashed through her mind again. The redhead couldn't hold back her tears, pursed her lips, and did the same with her tears. But the priestess wept loudly from what she felt. Diadi and Hymas were again surprised by the cry of the maid. Diadi tried to calm him down, his hands uncertainly approaching the shoulders of the little companion, and the dark-haired man was shocked and silent, standing still. Filia tried to calm down, but the tears kept flowing and flowing. The men were silent. However, when she calmed down, she announced her help. Her legs went inwards, she spoke uncertainly about herself. He continued to cry and asked for help to stop the war, wiping his tears from his face. It was night outside the window. The prince's office was luxurious. White walls, a chic golden chandelier, a large number of books and upholstered furniture wrapped in red silk. Things were carefully laid out on the sofa. A cape with a ruffled collar and dark gloves. There were documents on the table. The prince's fingers twisted wet curls of hair. The prince was sitting at the table, twisting his hair, damp after a shower. A predatory gaze stared ahead, thinking about something. Prince Elliot mentions a figure similar to him, but with a silk cape and a crown on his head. A smile appeared on Arrow Elliot's face, and then he leaned back completely, laughing evilly at something, leaning back. The laughter stopped when he heard a child cry. He sat straight and chose to look at the door. The guests of the castle were standing by the door, and one of the castle guards was knocking on the office, informing about the visit of the red-haired woman and her companion. And the prince remembered her. He was silently staring at the entrance, trying to understand what had happened this time, and the guest was crying. Priestess Lily was crying, holding the hand of Diada, who was silent, but did not take his eyes off her. Inside the castle it was empty, but quite bright. There were guards at the entrance to the prince's office. Very shocked by the news from the guests that the sacred scroll had disappeared, the prince stood up and looked at them while they were standing in front of the table. Diadi explained the reason in a calm tone, and Filia, in her turn, played the upset victim, hiding behind her bodyguard, covering half her face with the sleeve of her dress. That same evening, when evening began to fall over the horizon, Filia continued to beg, sobbing. Kima stood shocked in place, shaking in place, while the girl said that she would try to help, tried to wipe away her tears. The prince's assistant looked at him with visible displeasure because of the inconsistency, not to the liking of the little guest. While the man was trying to say something, the girl realized that she had seen memories and visions of the prince in her dream. She remembered that moment from the dream, in which the boy was sitting joyfully and laughing upstairs, and Kimas was standing below, looking at the pet of the palace. Filia continued to cry, followed by an apology. He was still silent, not understanding the child's behavior. In his examination, there was mistrust of her. He briefly asked what she would do. The girl, covering half her face with her sleeve, told about the ritual with the light. A flashback when Diadi's carriage drove back while the two sat on the horse. The girl's sapphire eyes showed coldness and severity. Tears were still in her eyes. She told about what she would report about the disappearance of the scroll. The prince's assistant was surprised, but remained silent, and asked a question about finding and hiding writings. The girl began to take something out of her sleeve. The girl handed Himasa the sacred scroll, and he brought his face closer to the interlocutor, examining the raised scroll. Diada's eyes widened at the girl's offer to burn, and the dark-haired man stepped away, and goosebumps ran over his skin. In the prince's office, Filia continued her performance, crying in front of the prince, telling about the value of the scroll, without which she cannot perform the ritual. The dark-haired prince was very angry listening to all this, while she was crying, but in her mind she was glad that they would give less work. The prince's eyes devoured the redhead, but the culprit of the disappearance of the manuscript turned her face away. Feeling his anger, His Highness Elliot stood up and loudly ordered his guards to send a search party to find the ritual scroll. He was silent for a while, angrily looking away. Considering another option, to get a new scroll, But there was a problem. The girl's eyes shone. She read his thinking and the mood of the prince. While the guests reported missing, Kimas excitedly walked from side to side, until he turned back. The girl's sapphire eyes looked at Leo Elyon. She tried to read again. Covered half of his face with the sleeve of his dress, the blue beast, whose eyes were burning with a blue glow, surrounded itself with thorns. The maid of the church stood in front of him, silently offering to pull out the thorns. There was an autumn frame in the yard. In the guest room, Kimas announced that he had sent a search team, but they found nothing, except for the wreckage of the carriage. Sitting on the couch, Filia asked about her things, but he answered that the refugees had taken care of everything. The girl was upset about the diary. Kimas's face was surprised. He tried to understand, looking into the girl's eyes, about her mood and suggestions. In response, Filia looked at the man, expecting such thoughts. The look between them ignited with a spark of anger. Until the interviewer addressed him as uncle, Lily sat on the couch, her eyes shining with curiosity, asked about the prince's affairs. He sadly replied to the guest that he was waiting for a report from him. Walking along the corridor, everywhere the windows are trying to penetrate the rays of the daytime sun. The red-haired priestess walked forward to the prince's office, humming a song to herself, followed by Diada. He stood in a stupor in the office, unable to understand her thoughts. Filia stopped, looking at her reflection in the window. Diada bent down to look at the reflection too, and understand the girl. He decided to ask, looking specifically at her, about her change in behavior. But in response, she asked about a better hairstyle. The guy was standing bent over to the interviewer and smiling sweetly. But Filia looked at him in surprise, but a blush appeared on her face. The two continued on their way to the prince's office, but the confused girl with red cheeks growled at the jovial companion behind. A question flashed through Diada's mind, from which she tried to understand what the hairstyle was all about. She stopped for a while and thought. There was blood on the floor, dripping from someone. Prince Elliot stood in front of his dead partner, holding a guest in one hand and a bloody sword in the other. Filia walked forward, her hair fluttering from side to side in the form of tails. The priestess confidently walked towards the prince, which looked cute. All the men, the guards all along the corridor, noticed it. All the guards' minds were marking the beautiful priestess from the church. Some were smiling, all of them blushed and looked in the direction of the guest. However, the true nature of Filia was known in the church, especially the headmistress and the high priest, looking sternly. Lily turned to Diada. Her personal bodyguard just smiles sweetly as he looks at her. But she turned back, clapped her fist against her flat palm. The blue eyes were preparing for their work. They began to shine. On the floor, the blood of the enemy was dripping onto the white tile. Everyone who came to the prince stood in such shock that they could not say a word. Only the eyes spoke two emotions, fear and surprise. Before the eyes of the guests who had just entered, the prince plunged his sword into his opponent, who was probably dead. Filia clung to Diada, frightened by what she saw. And all the guards called out to the prince in fright, running to help Prince Elliot. Ero's face showed no pity or certain emotions. He pulled out the sword from the enemy and let go of the guest. When the soldiers ran up to His Highness for help, he indifferently threw the corpse forward. He turned to the side, to the guests, while the guards dealt with the order. The red-haired priestess was trembling, holding Brother Diada's hand. The prince, with a light-hearted smile, understood the arrival of the little guest, who had a premonition of the funeral of the dead guest. He hid his sword in his pocket. The girl moved up for a moment, because he began to push the dead man with his foot. He smiled without pity, and said that he was an old friend. The girl's gaze is focused on the dead, old friend of the prince, who was lying in a puddle of blood and did not move. She tried to read the prince's soul, remembered the priest's words about the blood in the city of Akanzar, but everything trembled with fear. She took it in her hands, stood in front of Diada, spread her legs shoulder-width apart, and her hands were made into fists. I asked about the reason for such a concession. Outwardly, she looked confident, but inside she was afraid of the prince. The eyes began to read gradually, with a stern look. The answer was that it was the wish of the dead. Elliot looks down on the priestess, and she, in turn, looks at him sternly. Filia saw what happened. An old friend visited him. They talked to each other until he took a knife out of his sleeve and swung at the interlocutor. There was no surprise on Prince Axanar's face. What he saw made him reject his conscience for murder. the eyes stopped reading the soul of the beast. There was sadness in his eyes. In front of her, the prince became less intimidating. Sadness and pain left, and he was surrounded by thorns that did not allow anyone to approach him. Emotionlessly, Elliot gave the order to remove the corpse. Filia worriedly began to ask about the prince's well-being. The dark-haired handsome man looked at the priestess in surprise. The others also paid attention to the anxiety of the maid from the church. The tall man began to answer the priestess that everything was fine, spread his hands to his sides. However, the girl denied his words. Filia remained silent in concern, in response to which the prince mentioned the scriptures for the ritual. His face looked like a maniac. Someone else's blood was so dry on his clothes and face, he asked to think about the problem with the ritual. The girl still continued to insist on helping him, to whose answer he again reminded about the scroll. Taking the fabric of the dress with his hand, he squeezed very, very hard. In his voice, as well as in his eyes, there was concern for his well-being. Rose Monastery. The bell rang, and the stained glass windows of the belfry became brighter from the sun. A tea party was held between the Supreme and the headmistress. Between the headmistress and the priest at the tea party, a question arose about notifying Lily about the problem in advance. The dark-haired nun sighed, looked down worriedly. The priest paid attention and asked not to mess with her. She looked up at the gray-haired man. Daylight tried to penetrate into the office, illuminating the priest's office. He was pacing from side to side, calmly sipping a cup of tea, noticing the pet's peculiarity. Steam was coming from the freshly brewed tea. The man calmly drank the tea, while the dark-haired woman looked in surprise at the calm gray-haired priest. The executioner's finger was placed on the upper part of the forehead, saying that he could read minds. Filia left the office and repeated her loud cry. Accompanied by his brother, Diati, who was holding the upset red-haired girl, led him to their room. Everyone around noted the spoiled mood of the guests, looking in their direction. Filia, crying, was annoyed by the prince's concern for her. Grinded teeth, a murderous look. Eager to help and comfort him, she walked towards him, while Prince Axanar walked in her direction, not wanting her help. The hand of the beast prince hit the table sharply. Filia fell silent, but began to cry again. With a threat, the prince asked to be silent. Turning to the priestess, the prince calmly smiled, tossed his hair back. I asked the guest to leave while he was calm. On the way, the girl stomped her feet on the parquet, annoyed because she could not read the prince's soul and did not want to talk. Diati was frightened by this. She again presented to herself the image of a boy who is angry and betrayed by everyone. Filia realized that the tears were still flowing after talking to the prince. Diati tried to calm the girl, offered to carry her on his back. She returned to him, silently agreed to his proposal, still crying. He lowered his back to her so that she could climb. Both came to the room, were surprised to see what was happening. The castle guards searched Filia's room, all visible or inconspicuous places. Diati asked one of them to ask what they were doing in the room. The girl silently looked at the soldier, who replied that His Highness would be tricking the rooms. The dark-haired prince began to put on a fresh dark shirt. He looked away while he fastened the buttons on his sleeves. The room was searched upside down. Things were scattered and the bed was not made after the search by the guards. Filia's hand reached for the pillow. He pressed the soft decoration of the sofa to himself. The worried Diati looked at the back of the maid of honor, who began to breathe frequently. The guardian of the monastery was very angry after such a thing, as the master of the castle doubted, and was angry with the prince. Tore the pillow into pieces. Elliot's assistant came to the guest room after learning about the search, but his body and look spoke of surprise. Diati was standing on all fours, and Filia was sitting on him, more or less relaxed. He asked what was going on here, but Diati answered that he was calming down his companion. It became calm in the almost abandoned room, illuminated by daylight. The guests were sitting on the sofa. Hema started about this plan, which is not very good. The girl tiredly leaned back on the sofa, did not want to listen to her husband, but he again saw surprise from her. She turned to him, looked maliciously in his direction. The prince's assistant stood silently, but she saw despair and pain in his eyes, hiding his tears. What made Lily feel uneasy? The girl burst into tears again and began apologizing to him. The priestess turned to him, asking about the constant anger of the Lord Axanar. The girl wiped her tears with the sleeve of her dress, heard the opposite character of the prince before her arrival, more calm. the cause of dislike of the imperial power among the church from the very beginning of the history of life. The leadership of the church over the empire. Filia thought about the situation of the church and the emperor, as well as her visit. He wiped his tears, covered his face with another sleeve. Fingers tightened the edge of the sleeve. He sat in the same place, asking Himas what happened to the prince then. He just fell silent, lowered his eyes. The guests were surprised by the answer of His Highness's assistant, who answered uncertainly that he also knew less. Blood from the murdered friend was still flowing on the blade. 6 months ago day. A fountain in a circle from a beautiful garden of flowers. The inhabitants of the city began to discuss about the new ruler, the future wife of the prince. Night. The tension in the atmosphere began. Himas came out to the guest of his own house, dressing in his green coat. Himas had a look of shock on his face at the killing of his pet's brothers. Hoofs stomped. He ran to his master on horseback, looking ahead in fear. The rider had almost reached the palace. Only the gate to the castle remained. Himas dismounted from his horse, but the Oiruns at the door did not allow him to go to the prince. The soldiers defending the gate to the castle did not allow them to go forward. The dark-haired man was surprised. He could not believe what had happened. This one wanted to get to the prince, resisted the spears of the soldiers, tried to pass through them. The prince's assistant turned his gaze to the gray-haired commander. The commander turned to Himas and revealed that the traitorous prince had escaped and killed the brothers. The night sky, on which a large number of stars shone. The guests of the castle listened attentively to Himas, without taking their eyes off him. The dark-haired commander remembered his past, sighed heavily, closed his eyes. The silence was interrupted by a question from Filia. The number of soldiers. The look of the boys who were in the girl's room were surprised, staring at the girl. Himas nodded to himself, confirming the large number of guard soldiers in the castle. The red-haired priestess looked away, thinking about the whole situation of Prince Elliot's escape. Above the head of the prince's assistant hung a large gilded chandelier that worked in daylight. Himas ascertained the story from the emperor's words. When the prince returned to the castle, the adult teenager, he did not tell anything about the incident, issued an order not to disclose the story. Sitting comfortably on the sofa, she thought. But the story became more complicated. Diata's hand went up to ask. Everyone turned to him. Filia's guard asked about the theory of killing the queen, but this caused Himas to explode with rage. Priestess Lily's gaze turned to him in surprise. Filia's gaze, transferred to the prince's assistant, was calm. A popular reason was the seizure of power, a golden crown of thorns with 2 precious stones in it. After taking possession of the crown, it was bewitched. The prince has lost his mind, or cursed. In the end, the prince fell in love with a girl who was not of royal blood. Togo was seething with rage at the queen's mistrust, for she was closer to Prince Elliot. Himas gritted his teeth, anger in his eyes at the frivolity of Lily's behavior. The red-haired priestess thought about removing the necklace with the stone, grasping the place where the magic necklace hung. Filia again turned to Himas, who had calmed down, and a question arose about the women in the castle, to which he replied that there were nowhere in the castle. The man excused himself by not killing the women, looking at the interviewer in confusion. However, she herself emphasized the inconsistency of the story. The conversation continued. Another reason for the countless number of women in the castle were hired killers. Diati's gaze shifted from the man to the companion. The plan that the girl had planned was cut short. Her face showed her dissatisfaction and anger very well. The disgruntled voice of the girl could be heard very loudly in the room about the reduced number of murders, to which Himas confirmed the answer. Filia thought about all the information she heard. Filia paid attention to the bags under the prince's eyes. Himas did not expect such comments from the girl, and sitting comfortably on the couch with a cute look, she asked for a thread and a needle. Himas sighed expectantly from the sudden change in mood. There were colorful threads in the box. A large number of needles were stuck in a small pillow, and buttons were arranged in different inner boxes. Guest room. Diati sewed something on a small pillow, stuck out a needle and thread, and Filia managed the process. In the hands of the girl was a created toy, sewn by Brother Diati, with a careless seam and sewing of ears, protruding cotton wool, randomly placed buttons. Both understood that the toy looked scary. If Diati was tired and could not understand her plan, the priestess Lily watched with pleasure. There was still light outside the window, just as it illuminated the white guest room. However, When the girl called the sewn toy by his name, he again took his time and addressed the toy by his name. The little priestess hugged the toy made by her companion and smiled slyly. Behind the prince's office, the security guard stood still, but the emotions of today's day and experiences were noticeable. On the prince's table lay a scary toy of Didi, who was smiling sweetly. Prince Elliot looked coldly at the gift from the guest. The prince was still looking at the toy, but Filia was standing a little further from the table, gracefully twirling in place, and explained such a gift as an apology. The owner of the castle still thought silently, but his gaze became predatory. Negativity emanated from him. The girl stood up straight, holding her hands, which she hid under the long sleeves of her dress, in front of her chest, tried to apologize, which surprised Diadi little by little. Leo Elliott's gaze shifted from the girl to his gift. The priestess Lily thought, covered half her face with her hand, about the distrust of the prince, and looked just as thoughtfully at her interlocutor. The prince's eyes were tired. The bags under his eyes were very obvious, but this time the look was not so angry. The prince remained silent and thought about something. Filia prepared herself to read the prince's thoughts again. Sapphire eyes shone, began to read the silent interlocutor. In Prince Arrow's mind, she saw those moments of Lily's concern for the well-being of her betrayed comrade Elliot. The prince's gaze remained dangerous, as if from a predator, but the memories of the floating girl slightly confused the redhead. The confused priestess looked at the interlocutor, but felt fear again. The predatory gaze of the other blue eyes examined the child. In front of him stood a little girl who was standing confidently, but she was showing fear. There was silence between the guests and the owner of the castle. Only he thought about the motives of the interviewer from the church.
In the look of the blue-eyed prince, the desire to kill was read. He looked ahead without pity.
Confused little Lily was trembling with fear as she read the thoughts of the brooding dark-haired prince. A white dishcloth slipped from the hands of the director of the monastery, which was soaked with water. She looked at him. The woman again remembered the words of the gray-haired priest about the girl's abilities, but the woman's eyes showed anxiety. The dark-haired woman lowered herself to the handkerchief. The mood and look of the prince changed suddenly, which made the girl look at him in silence. The prince accepted the gift, brought it closer to him, and waved his hand to one of the guards, and he approached. Filia was in shock. Elliot ordered the guard to take the girl's gift to him. She stood still in confusion. Then the blue eyes of the dark-haired handsome turned their attention to the priestess. The girl's hands closed in a lock, pressed to her own chest. Priestess Lily, who held her hands in the castle, began to shine, as if the Holy Spirit. The look of the guard and the prince, which the unexpected words of the little girl's plea kept on him. Everyone in Prince Arrow's office turned their eyes to Filia, who began to pray to herself. Relations between the royal family and the priests were not very warm. Confrontations between those and those. The girl's spirits rose. She felt the wings of exaltation, the white wings of an angel lifting her up. On the face of the dark-haired prince, you could already see the misunderstanding from Lily's words. The red-haired girl continued to read the prince's mind, putting her hands on her face. Cheeks turned red. The girl understood the prince's distrust of priests, women, and her, who, in his opinion, could be a murderer. The prince, with raised hands, sincerely thanked the guest and continued the story about the lost scroll. The priest-student began to approach him. Clasping his hands together, the dark-haired prince curiously began to inquire about the guest's opinion. The girl continued to hold her hands in the castle, as if praying, explaining the need for prayer due to a heavy burden in her soul. On one of the shelves of the cabinet, which stood behind the prince in the office, the church cross still stood, but in a cobweb. Filia again turned on the role of a cute girl who glowed with happiness and smelled of roses. From the words she never spoke, everyone around looked at her in surprise. The watchman felt uneasy because of this, and the rag fell from the hands of the nun again. After offering help, Lily was still glowing, and the prince turned to her in a calm tone. He continued to threaten in a subtle way, with a different tone and look, condescendingly. The pupil of the Rose Monastery became in itself uncomfortable, unpleasant to play the role of an idiot. But I thought about it, silently thought about taking advantage of it. She reflected so much on the image of the haughty Prince Leo Elyon, who was not really smiling. Gritting his teeth, the priestess from the church continued the conversation with the royal heir, apologized out of respect. He fell silent, opened his lips, ready to say something. Elyon continued to listen to the student of the high priest, no longer with the same look as before, but already judiciously. With closed eyes, in a calm tone, Filia turned to the emperor's son again. I finished with my offer to become his joy, pressed my hand to my chest, and looked up. From the words heard, the guards coughed harder, a plate broke in the monastery. Everything around became noisy. Filia looked around in surprise. Filia looked up at Diada, who was also very surprised. Then Filia thought about the last words, which sounded strange. The girl understood that it looked strange in itself, as if it were a confession of loyalty and love. She blushed in embarrassment. A large number of birds rose above the castle, which surrounded the towers with a large number of roofs, and the sky was still clear and bright. The sky was clear. Diada's hand gradually descended behind the owner, holding on to the knobs of the rock. The legs went down first, also holding on to the uneven rock. Diada sank lower and lower, looked down, while Filia sat and waited above. Their conversation, where she stood near the edge of the cliff, along which her companion slipped, was not far from the city walls. She sat on a haunch and smiled, supported that if something jumped down, but let him catch it. He also smiled, but silently. The lump of rock that Lily's bodyguard was holding onto began to crack and break off. The stone broke away from the stone wall. The man was unexpectedly frightened and began to fall. The fair-haired guy fell down, but when the girl started asking about his well-being, he briskly answered that he was alive. Diada stood up, shook the dust off his clothes. The brown-eyed guard's gaze fell to the side. She drew attention to herself. Raspberry bush, fresh dark pink raspberry. What the assistant maid was looking for when he went downstairs, he quickly found. A bush with raspberries grew nearby. A small amount of raspberries lay in a napkin, in the hands of a small priestess. The girl was delighted to examine the wild raspberry, but the boy looked at her and could not understand how she knew, but she calmly ate one berry. Ate one berry. She opened her eyes from the deliciousness. She beamed at the delicious berry and brought one of the berries to Diada to taste. In her memory, the girl recalled her childhood, where she was in a blue dress, watching a tree. Diada's gaze is focused on the girl's hand, which was holding a raspberry, and brought it closer to him. The boy opened his mouth, sat on one of his bent knees to be at the same height as the girl, and she fed him the collected berries. At the same time, there was a conversation at the table. At the table, there was a commotion, talking among themselves, and in front of him was the general of the search team, who reported on the failures of the search. However, Elliot sat still, sleepy-eyed, eyes closed, listening to the report of the soldiers who were questioning the bandits, but had not seen the scroll. One of the counselors, a gray-haired man, offered to stop the search. Another, a stocky man with dark hair, suggested re-requesting the scroll. There was still a dispute between the counselors about the second proposal and the status of the priestess, since she was still a student. The general was still standing by the door, looking away, waiting for an answer. When the conversation turned to noise, especially about the church, the prince's eyes opened. There was a sharp order from the prince to shut up, and everyone fell silent and turned their attention to His Highness. He smiled cheerfully, lifted his head from his hand, and lightly talked about death. But suddenly, with a smile, he began to look maliciously at the advisors. Despair and negative energy prevailed in the room, all in the same room, offering to re-request a new scroll. After one of the questions, the boy clicked with a smile, and in response to the question, he said in a cold tone and with a condescending look that in the case of churches, he would refuse. The prince would replace the title of religious emperor. All the advisors were shocked by such a decision. They fell silent, but their looks and plasticity of their bodies showed surprise at such a surprise. In the corridor, the guests of the castle were waiting for the prince to present a delicious gift. Filia observed behind her tall companion with a sweet look and a beaming smile. A prince was walking down the corridor with a large number of advisors and soldiers behind him, and once again hatred was felt from his gaze. The Prince Emperor's hand suddenly grasped the joyful girl. Filia's neck was covered by two of his hands. He began to strangle her. The sight of his enemies was predatory and dangerous. She was breathing heavily from the strong squeeze. Tears were flowing from her, and she only quietly turned to him. Her hands were shaking, and therefore the berries from the wild bush began to fall from the hands of the priestess, but these were all the prince's thoughts that she saw. Filia looked down at the fallen berries. Most of the crushed berries lay in front of her. The guests raised their heads from the berries to the prince, who was coming closer. Prince Elyon looked at the red-haired girl angrily when she felt all the negative feelings and realized that she met at the wrong time. The The prince lowered his eyes to the crushed berries and in a cold tone began to criticize the guest's bad manners. He lowered himself, at the level of her eyes, lowered one knee, approached her to whisper about being careful while staying here. The boot of the dark-haired prince stood on the raspberry, crushed more. The girl's gaze was lowered from the berries. She was frightened and upset. The prince rose from his knees. The dark-haired majesty turned his attention to the companion of the priestess, who was sadly watching her, but remained silent. Alyon's hand swung in his direction. His majesty raised his hand to Diada, slapped Filia's guard hard, from which no one expected such concessions. The prince charged at the shocked boy, who bore a red mark from the slap. The girl looks at it in shock, covering her mouth in fear. Diada took a step back from the force of the slap before accusing him of neglecting Lily. From what she heard and saw, Filia began to cry, trying to calm down so as not to anger Prince Axanar. The dark-haired handsome man continued to beat the girl's bodyguard. Diada did not resist it. But the girl could not look, but the guards of the castle stopped her. Diada fell to the floor, his face on the crushed raspberry, and the prince's foot stepped on him. The guard held the frightened priestess while the prince kept his foot on Diada. After the fall in the corridor, not so much time passed, but in her own room, the redhead tried to heal her companion. Filia's hands were shaking as they wiped the raspberry dirt from the battered Diada's face. The girl was shaking from her guilt, what was done to the companion. However, he was smiling, trying not to notice what had happened, with swollen pike and dried blood from his nose. She screamed because of such frivolity. She was angry, but her hands were shaking, and tears were flowing from her eyes. He tried to reassure that everything was fine with him, but the upset priestess kept crying. The room was illuminated by a bright, spacious guest room, but the mood worsened. Lily tried to apologize to him. The priest-student's tears could not stop flowing, and she muffled the scream of pain with clenched teeth while Diada tried to calm the child. Filia pressed her hands to her eyes, still sobbing in front of her guardian, while her brown-eyed companion stroked her head to calm her down. The next day, the sun illuminated the empty snow-white corridors of the castle. Himas, in a crushed mood, came to Filia's room with a Diada. Lily felt the same way and looked tiredly at the prince's assistant. They looked at each other in silence, while the battered Diada watched them from the side. The tired red-haired girl sighed and offered to come in, but Himas took it as an insult, as he was no less tired from work. The girl glanced at the sofa, tiredly asked for tea, but Himas's thoughts still lingered on yesterday. The girl turned to the table, turned to Himas, and assured that she would not disturb the prince. The look was surprised. The light brown eyes froze for a certain time. When the girl turned around, she confidently stood sideways to Himas, announcing that he himself would come to her. Crows began to fly over the castle in the daylight. A large number of birds flying very close were noticed by the castle guards on the towers. The locals themselves also noticed the arrival of birds that covered the bright sky. At dinner, the prince ate meat until he was eaten. The butler of the castle noticed outside the window a crowd of crows covering the sky. The boy watched what was happening above the city with a suspicious look. Himas was walking from Filia's room, trying to find out from her words and concession. Gradually, the thought flashed through my head that the fictions about the power of the student from the Rose Monastery. But suddenly the thought stopped. The eyes widened again from what they saw. Himas went out on one of the balconies of the castle, saw crows covering the bright sky. Out of shock, he leaned against the wall, still looking at the sky. Crows flying from side to side covered the warm sun like rain clouds. Then, white bones from dead people and animals were released from the beaks of birds that flew over the message near the castle. The bones fell on the heads of the bewildered local citizens, who were looking up. Bones fell, as if in hail, on confused people who screamed and ran away from their homes. The crow's wings covered the rays of the warm sun. Filia became herself, an adult, looked up. Diada was standing in the bedroom, waiting for Filia, who went to another room, but did not return for a long time. Filia's companion stood in the middle of the room, worried about the girl who was in the bathroom. There was a commotion from the guards, who were commenting on the situation on the street. The birds started throwing bones in the castle yard. The crows began to tear flags and cry around the castle grounds, and the guards tried to stop them. And the locals worshipped them to appease the higher powers. The speaker stood in front of the prince, but alarmed by the situation and the calm tone of the prince, who ordered everyone to calm down. The prince's eyes fell on the plate, but he ordered it to be removed. A raven flew into the room where Prince Elyon was dining. The dark-haired prince noticed a raven raising its claws above him as if ready to attack. Everyone looked at the prince in fear. Kimas ran to the dining room. However, the raven just flew over the table, and Aaron Elliot calmly gave the order to deal with the bird. His Majesty calmly watched the crow, which overturned the plate with meat. A raspberry fell out of the bird's beak onto the inverted plate. Everyone was very surprised by the raspberries that the priestess brought. The blue eyes of the prince were no less surprised. In front of the prince, on an inverted plate, lay a raspberry, and the room became quiet. Filia was standing on the balcony in her childlike form, holding in one hand the necklace she had just put on and looking at the sky. The blue-eyed priestess is already confidently watching the situation. An almost crushed berry lay on a snow-white plate in front of the prince. Diadi sat in the guest room in the morning. She opened the door and went out. Diadi got up from his seat, offered the priestess breakfast, but she silently walked past him. He sat down in a chair, exhaled. Her look was angry and irritated. The girl angrily criticized yesterday's incident, but Diadi listened silently and briefly supported her companion. Someone quickly and confidently ran up to the room. Filia was angry with him because of his frivolity, but he tried to calm down and could not feel her anger. Priestess Lily sat confidently on the chair, waiting for someone. Diadi looked at the door. An excited Hymas ran to the guest room, calling the priestess. Filia sat in her place, but Hymas himself loudly asked to go to the prince. But the girl, sitting on the red chair, said frivolously that she did not want to go to the prince. Hymas looked at Filia in confusion. The girl's gaze was fixed on the guest to her room. However, Filia began to confidently speak and smile about the order. Diadi looked at her in surprise. Filia sat down snugly in her silk chair, crossed her legs one on top of the other, self-assuredly announced the meeting here. Yesterday, when Filia was in her room and Diadi looked excitedly at her closed door, Diadi, with a bruised face, was excited for her, holding the sheets to the bed. The girl began to pull herself up, standing on her tiptoes on the chair. Grown-up Lily was standing on a chair, and it was on the table. Filia reached for the chandelier. The hand reached for the diamond stones. The hands were shaking. Adult Lily took off one of the ornaments, tired but joyfully holding the stone. Filia was looking at the door, but Diadi was sitting and reading calmly in the room. In one hand she held an ornament made of a chandelier, and in the other she took off a necklace with a similar white stone in it. She remembered that moment from the prince's thoughts, where he wanted to strangle. The moment when he mercilessly strangled a red-haired girl, kill him with his own hands. How then she gasped while crying, looking into the eyes of the merciless prince. Grown-up Filia went to the window and opened the glass door. Looked up. The hand with the fake stone raised up, drawing the attention of the birds that flew by. Filia came to the edge of the balcony, and a crow flew closer to her, began to address the bird. But the raven's words somehow surprised the red-haired priestess, which made her gaze fixed on the feathered one. Filia was surprised that the crow knew her, but kept asking the bird how she survived. Filia's hand, which was holding a necklace with a magic stone, gripped the balcony door tightly, and she decided to offer something in exchange for a fake stone. But the bird still fluttered in the air before the adult Lily asked for her necklace in exchange, which made Lily sharply grab the hand with the necklace to her chest. The crow fell silent and looked at Lily. The girl looked sternly at the bird, looking at the bird. Imas was shocked by the words of the little priestess. He angrily criticized Filia's behavior for having the audacity to order the prince. But the girl only spread her arms to her sides and sighed. But Himas is irritated by such words and disrespect. At the words about respect for the royal family, the girl looked at the interlocutor and noticed disrespect for ordinary people. Filia continued to sit on the chair, self-confidently saying what she was asking for a lot, and Diata was hurt, but he was still confused about the rules in the kingdom. The girl began to talk about loyalty, not to the family itself, but Kimas fell silent, as if it had touched his life. The brown-eyed assistant prince's eyes widened. Filia continued to confidently discuss Himas and the importance of a law that is worth obeying. A gray-haired man sat on the throne. The throne was covered with gold and shone like the sun. The high back of the throne rose like a mountain. Ants ran over Himas's body. He fell silent, clenched his hands into fists. The girl smiled confidently and insisted that the prince come personally. After the words, Prince Elyon walked along the corridor to Filia with Hymas and the soldiers. The door of Filia's room opened, and the prince stood on the threshold with his assistant and guards. Priestess Lily dropped to one knee to bow. He put one hand to his heart, and the other lay down on the floor. Her sapphire eyes looked at the prince sternly. While the prince calmly asked about his visit, he continued to walk in the direction of Filia. The prince's gaze did not change, still so calm and distrustful of the priest. Said about suspicion of her. The girl was still sitting on her knee in front of him, but he went aside. He went to the window. The red-haired student of the priest rose to her feet. An order to calm everyone down came from Prince Elyon. She asked about his suspicion, to which he turned his head to her, denied such abilities. The prince's gaze gradually became cold as Filia began to refuse his orders. Everyone present fell silent. Everyone was afraid of the prince's gaze. She did not lose confidence from the boy's point of view. She only noticed how difficult it was to talk to him. But she exhaled. With the window, the birds were still fluttering over the city, covering the sun's rays. The redhead was looking at the prince, when the look of the blue-haired prince was a little confused. Everyone present was more embarrassed by the words of the priestess, and a smile appeared on the face of Elyon Aro. He looked at the interviewer with a smile. His eyes lit up with anger, but he looked calm. The girl's eyes lit up with a sapphire glow. She began to read the prince again to find out why he hated her. In his memories, he remembered the first meeting with her when he lifted the girl's head up. But the look of Filia, who was frightened, was considered beautiful. The prince was standing by the window, and she was shocked by what she saw. Beautiful, pure sapphire eyes that looked at the prince's thoughts, hands clenched, and goosebumps ran through the body from reading Elyon's thoughts. A red-haired girl, who was closely connected with the church, in a simple dress came down from heaven and shone like a halo of all saints. However, the look was stern and threatening. He remembers the moment with the crow that brought a berry to the table, and such a noise spread not only around the castle, but also in the city. Filia was always reading his soul. She understood his irritation towards her. There was silence between them. Only Filia's thoughts crept in, and only her cute appearance became a problem. Servant Lily began to speak from the third person about birds' preference for shiny objects. Birds surrounded the castle, and people on the street still bowed. The prince agreed to this idea with the shiny stones, looking towards the window. I expected him to say something strange, like yesterday, but the girl noticed a problem, and he turned his attention to the student of the high priest. Kima stood there alarmed, and Liddy remembered the first problem, with the ceremony. The girl confidently declared that she could organize it at least now, which surprised everyone by the words themselves. The dark-haired Prince Axanar had a question about the scriptures, to which the girl lightly explained that she was saddened by the disappearance. The girl still explained to him that the scriptures were not as important as faith in God. Hymus listened to what they said among themselves, puzzled by the words of the angel Rose. The sun was still shining over the rocky deserts. The girl slyly, but confidently, looked at the joyful prince, predatorily looking at the interlocutor from the church. The prince calmly asked about the possibility of holding the ceremony now, to which she answered that she agreed, which she expected. With a joyful smile, he asked to perform the sacred ritual, but the girl's sudden words about the inspection puzzled the prince. He opened his eyes. Everyone around was again surprised by the words of the girl, who confirmed about checking the prince, reading his thoughts. On the shelf of the closet in Filia's room, the cross is cleaned of dust and cobwebs. The prince stood silently, trying to understand all this. But the owner of the castle lost everything, was angry, and looked maliciously at the priestess Lily. The girl lowered her foot to the floor, bowing before His Highness. With a pose of supplication, she slyly announced a new period of days before the ritual. The guards had bags of stones from the chandeliers in their hands. The same pebbles from the chandeliers began to fall from the castle. Birds began to catch and fly about their business. The prince's guests looked at the proposed plan of the priestess Lily. Diati was a little surprised by the preference of the ravens, as it did not surprise Filia. The look of the girl's sapphire eyes was fixed on the sky. While the uncle was directing the plan from the chandeliers, the guards were removing lightning stones from the chandeliers. One watchman held the bag, the other took it off. Himas's gaze silently guided the process of the plan. Filia kept looking through the window at the execution of the plan. Outside the window, the number of crows was decreasing. Diati began to ask about the fictitious ceremony through which he could excommunicate the church. But Filia was not upset by this. She just stood silently. She just exhaled silently. She remembered that superior character and mocking smile. The blue-eyed prince looks ahead. He stood by the window in his study, watching everything that was happening on the territory of the castle. In her room, Filia cheerfully wished to continue the plan, regardless of the excommunication, to which Diati listened silently. There was a knock at their door. Kimas and the castle guards knocked on their room. Both Defati and Filia turned towards the voice, because the commander of the search team was waiting for them. Kimas, the commander of the search party, came to the guest room with him, in steel armor and with a scar on his face. I asked for the details of the scroll. His gaze was stern and cold as he looked at Priestess Lily. Filia felt uncomfortable with the commander with the scar, but she began to read his thoughts herself. Filia politely asked what he wanted and dared to describe the appearance of the sacred writing. He nodded in response. Filia began to describe the papyrus writings in the most beautiful little metal box with the image of a dove on it. Everyone present began to imagine it. Only Himas and Diati could not believe the description. Imas remembered that old writing on a wooden core. Commander Preto listened and nodded. Filia continued to lie about the scroll, playing poor and poor, blamed the ravens who could take it. I opened my eyes, tried to read the commander of the search group. Commander Prieto silently nodded and thanked. At the same time, he left the room to do his work, and the present room watched him silently. She thought about his person, clenched her hand into a fist. Filia remembered this city, which had not changed for a long time. I saw my reflection as a little girl in a blue dress. It was evening. The sun was setting behind the horizon, intertwining the orange and purple shades of the sky. The soldiers began to clean up the garbage left by the crows, to take the bones out of the city. And rumors spread among the people about the priestess with the crows. Rumors spread among the people about the prince mocking the angel rose, and the crow was like a punishment. And then he repented. The morning came. The sun began to rise over the castle. Filia came to the prince's office with her bodyguard, smiling sweetly. Prince Elyon also smiled at the guests. There was silence between them, for it was the first day before the next 3. It was quiet everywhere. The security guard was humbly and calmly standing behind the door. Prince Elyon Arrow greeted the early guests with a smile. Filia bowed a little in politeness and asked about his dream. He only smiled and lied about his dream. He opened his eyelids, and the prince's words sounded an order to leave the room. The prince repeated the order, asking everyone but Priestess Lily to speak in private. The men have a puzzled look on their faces. The guards, who were standing at the door of the prince's office, took out Diati and Himas, following the order of the owner of the castle. Both turned to the door. Filia looked after them in confusion, remaining with the prince in his office. The priestess remembered the moment when the prince raised his hand to Diata. She turned her head to him, tried to mentally reassure herself that she would not hurt the little child from the church. Her eyes shone with the beautiful night, dark blue sky. She began to read the soul of the interlocutor. She thanked him for the conversation with a cute smile, but he calmly thanked her. Prince Iro looked at her, smiled slyly. He had a lot of thoughts about the ceremony, but there was no anxiety about the war. It sounded quite strange. Filia was not expecting it. She stood before him, in complete silence. Filia directly asked, still reading his soul, about the reason for the war. However, he confidently replied to Filia that he is not gathering the army, but the people themselves want it. Lily fell silent because she was embarrassed by such an answer. She confidently stood her ground and asked about preparations for war. The prince's gaze was fixed on the interlocutor, straight and calm about the unsuccessful reign of the emperor. The girl was surprised. An emperor who granted the right to rule to a princess from an enemy kingdom to take the throne and the right to rule. The boy's legs turned towards the window. The prince confidently answered the priest-student's question about the situation with the unsuccessful reign of the previous ones. In front of the prince, outside the window, was his city, which the emperor owns. But she listened carefully to her husband, feeling certain feelings from the interlocutor. He continued to talk about correcting mistakes in the new era. Filia was silent. The prince turned to the interlocutor. His gaze was confident, and he himself confidently desired to execute a fair trial. The sun illuminated the silhouette of a dark-haired, handsome man. His eyes were no longer so cruel or angry. They were confident. She is puzzled by his words. She almost believed Elyon's story. A mysterious, charismatic personality, from whom you can feel the cold, even when he smiled, and his eyes stared into the depths of the sea. There was silence between them as he turned to Lily, who was expecting a different answer to her question. The girl in the same place began to say something about herself until she asked him to share the answer. It asked the thought cryptically, eyes still reading Prince Aksan's soul. The blue-eyed prince is lightly in charge of the government. However, all the words and thoughts that she read with her sapphire eyes and could not understand in any way. She remembered the legend of the prince who escaped from the castle, the murder of his brothers by his own hands, and the fall of the emperor, the crown broken in half. The mysterious figure of Leo Elyon stares intently at the priest's student with a predatory gaze. Filia threw herself into bed, staring at the ceiling. Next to her sat Diadi, who noticed the disappointed voice and look of the girl again after the conversation with the prince. She went back into her thoughts to ask specifically about the prince. She remembered again the conversation she had had alone with the prince when it was still morning, which lit up his office. She insisted on telling her thoughts. The prince stood aside from the interviewer, who immediately asked about the future of the residents of this city. The gaze of the maid's sapphire eyes shone so clearly, they tried to read the prince, a stern and cold look. Leon looked at the serious priestess, but he went aside and told his story about the situation with the housing, comparing it to fallen leaves. A red-haired girl with a surprised look translated into her voice that the inhabitants would sacrifice for the sake of the prince. He continued to translate the words, the comparison of the son as an imperial family, and she looked at the prince in astonishment. Prince Leon sat down on his silk sofa. He continued the conversation from a soft place, telling about the inability of ordinary people to perform miracles. Filia stood there intently, listening to Leona. The dark-haired handsome man with a measured tone asked about God. What exactly does the finder do? From the mentioned conversation, she began to wave her legs and arms. She felt that this conversation was lost. Both the topic did not go well, and she herself became confused. Diadi tried to calm the companion, who began to insult herself and to encourage her, smiling all the time. During the conversation, in the evening, ravens began to fly to the balcony of the guest room of the castle. She sat down on the bed and decided to visit the prince only in the morning, since she was not in the mood in the evening or at lunchtime. Diadi silently agreed with her. Something began to knock on the window. Both of them immediately paid attention to the sound. A raven was knocking on the door with its beak to the owner of the room. The bird told them to open the door with a look. Diadi only looked in surprise, but the girl herself understood who had come to her. Her look was confused. Filia's companion turned his head towards her, and she herself turned away, trying not to reveal her surprise. Filia buried her face in the pillow, and the crow kept knocking and knocking at the window. But she tried not to pay attention, pretending to be sleepy. The bird did not stop knocking, but Diadi understood what he wanted and offered to leave her alone for a certain time. She rose to her arms and nodded in agreement. He smiled. Due to the awkward situation, she covered her face with her hands, said about a certain time. When Diadi left, she opened the balcony door and shouted angrily at the crow. The bird released a fake stone from its beak onto the concrete curb. With a certain understanding, she only looked angrily at the pebble from the chandelier. Filia took the transparent stone from the chandelier. She began apologizing to the dark bird, not counting on a large number of raven helpers. But the bird was still fluttering in place, said another. The minister of the church was confused. From fluttering in place, the crow's feathers flew away from the crow's wings. He said he wanted a special gift. A small wind arose from the fluttering of the feathers, blowing the girl's red curls. The door to Himas's office suddenly opened. The prince's aide's gaze lifted his head from the paperwork to the door. Filia visited the uncle and asked from the threshold about the vault. He fell silent in misunderstanding. The priestess Lily went to him and repeated the question about the vault, and Himas remained silent in misunderstanding. In response, he fell silent, closed his eyes for ages. The answer came shortly. Filia asked for the key there. The priest student, with a terrible look and outstretched hand, repeated the words so that he would give the key. In the basement, in front of the door, there were 2 guards. The door was open, to which the prince's guests came. When the storage door opened, dust rose. Filia covered her nose with her sleeve, and Diadi held the lamp, and they walked forward. Filia looked ahead in surprise. For a certain long time, everything that belonged to the emperor long before the meeting with the prince, everything lay in place and accumulated. Her eyes just looked at all this with sadness. She lowered her hand from her face. They began to walk through the guarded vault, discussing the return of the prince, from whose information there is an attraction of a bride for the cursed prince. Filia could not believe the curse, searching what was nearby. Diadi asked what they were looking for here. Against the answer, Filia announced an independent search, because she did not want to reveal the goal. Search the shelves of the filing cabinet. Filia felt the boy's gaze behind her, stopped moving, and turned to him. He looked with interest and smiled, expecting a certain answer.